There is a moment, somewhere between the last order and the first silence, when a man realizes that the world he was trained to serve no longer exists. The maps on the table still show lines and arrows. The radio still crackles with voices. But something has broken, irreversibly, somewhere above him. And in that moment, a general must decide, does he follow the order or does he follow his conscience? This is the story of a man who chose conscience. His name was Walther Wenck. He was born in the cathedral town of Wittenberg on the 18th of September 1900, in a Germany that still had a Kaiser. He would die 81 years later, in a car accident on a quiet Austrian road, in a Germany divided by ideology and shame. Between those two endpoints, he lived one of the most quietly extraordinary military lives of the 20th century, a life of obsessive preparation, sudden catastrophe, and one final decision that historians still argue about today. He was, at the peak of his career, the youngest general of branch in the entire German army. He was called, with a mixture of admiration and condescension, the boy general. He had the kind of face people described as too young for the uniform he wore, and yet the mind behind that face had been shaped by decades of war college discipline, Eastern Front crisis management, and the grinding, brutal education of watching armies collapse from within. He had seen the Soviet juggernaut up close. He knew what it meant. He had told Adolf Hitler, to his face, in language so informal it earned a reprimand, that the Eastern Front looked like Swiss cheese, full of holes. That remark almost ended his career. Instead, it made it. By the spring of 1945, when the Soviet armies of Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev were converging on Berlin from two directions at once, Hitler, sealed inside his underground bunker, running out of time and running out of sanity, reached for one final name, Wenck, the boy general. The last hope. He was ordered to take his 12th Army, an army still being assembled from fragments and exhausted men, and drive east, drive into the steel curtain of the Red Army, drive through it, reach Berlin, save the capital, save the Reich. What Wenck did instead, and why, is the real story. So settle in. Let this be your companion through the long quiet hours. This is not a story of triumph dressed in flags. This is a story of a soldier who understood, perhaps better than anyone alive at that moment, what the word impossible actually meant, and chose to define for himself what duty really was. If you find this documentary valuable, if it helps you unwind and think and rest, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. More long-form historical documentaries are waiting for you, and your support makes them possible. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Undercore. Chapter 1. The Town. On the Elbe. Boyhood in a Nation. Unraveling. Underscore. Wittenberg, in the autumn of 1900, was a town weighted with history it could barely contain. It was the place where, almost 4 centuries earlier, a monk named Martin Luther had reportedly nailed his protests to a church door, splitting the Christian world in two. It was a town that understood, in its very stones and cobbles, that a single act of defiance could change everything. Walther Wenck, born there on the 18th of September 1900, absorbed none of this as a deliberate lesson. Children rarely do, but the town shaped him in subtler ways, in the particular cadence of discipline and quiet conviction that characterized its institutions, its Protestant work ethic, its inherited sense that duty was not something explained, it was something done. His father, Maximilian Wenck, was an army officer. The household, therefore, ran on the rhythms of military life, long before Walther ever wore a uniform. Early mornings, structured days, the quiet understanding that service was simply what men of a certain formation did. He was the third son, which meant he inherited neither the firstborn's weight of expectation nor the youngest child's liberty. He was middle ground, shaped by watching, by learning to be precise in a world that rewarded precision. In 1911, at the age of 10, the year most boys in that era were absorbed in the street games and mild rebellions of late childhood, Walther Wenck enrolled in the Naumburg Cadet Corps of the Prussian Army. It was not unusual for officer families to send sons this route. It was, in fact, the expected track. But what was unusual was how completely the boy took to it. The Prussian cadet system was not a school in any contemporary sense of the word. It was an institution designed to compress the formation of character into an accelerated program of physical rigor, academic discipline, and hierarchical obedience. Boys were woken early, drilled, examined, and evaluated with a constancy that left little room for the casual distractions of civilian boyhood. Most students found aspects of it brutalizing. Some broke under it. Wenck, by all accounts, did not break. He absorbed. He adapted, with the kind of fluency that is not trained so much as it is discovered. The realization that his mind worked most clearly inside structure, that discipline did not cage him but focused him. From Naumburg, as he grew older, he moved on to the secondary military school at Gross Lichterfeld in the spring of 1918. That institution, nestled on the outskirts of Berlin, was prestigious by any measure of the time. It had shaped many of the officers who were, at that very moment, bleeding out in the trenches of the Western Front. But by the spring of 1918, the Western Front was entering its final convulsions. The Germany that Wenck had been trained to serve was dying, and it would not survive the year. The armistice came in November 1918, and with it came a collapse that no cadet training could have prepared anyone for. Germany did not merely lose a war, it lost its identity. The Kaiser abdicated. The empire dissolved. In its place came the uncertain, contested thing called the Weimar Republic. Born in humiliation, forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, forced to accept blame for a war that most Germans felt had been forced upon them in equal measure by the entire concert of European powers. For a young man who had spent his formative years inside an institution dedicated to the glory and service of that empire, this was not an abstraction, it was personal. The world he had been shaped for no longer existed. The old German army was reduced, by the terms of Versailles, to 100,000 men, a skeletal force for a nation that had fielded millions. Commissions were scarce, careers uncertain, and the thousands of officers and soldiers demobilized, without pensions or prospects, spilled into the streets of a country in social and economic freefall. Many of them joined the paramilitary formations that sprang up in the chaos. The Freikorps, armed bands operating in legal and moral grey zones, fighting communists on German streets, fighting Poles on the eastern borders, fighting anything that moved and could be framed as a threat to German order. In 1919, the 18-year-old Wenck joined one such formation, the Freikorps unit known as von Oven. He was wounded in the leg during this period, a detail that his later biographers note but do not dramatize. The Freikorps experience was not, for him, an ideological awakening. He would show no signs of political extremism throughout his career, no hunger for the intoxicating narratives of racial destiny that would later consume so many of his generation. For Wenck, the Freikorps appears to have been, simply, the only available form of soldiering in a country that had abolished its army. A young man trained for nothing else, doing the only thing available to him. In May of 1920, he transitioned into the regular Reichswehr, the 100,000-man army permitted under Versailles, as a private. It was a demotion in prestige from what his cadet training had pointed toward, but he accepted it without apparent complaint and began again from the ground up. He was commissioned as a lieutenant in the infantry on the 1st of February, 1923. He was 22 years old, and the Germany around him was in the grip of a hyperinflationary crisis so severe that workers were being paid twice daily so they could spend their wages before they lost their value. The world was unstable. His career was uncertain. He had, nevertheless, decided to stay. That decision, to stay, to work within the system, to build slowly, was perhaps the most defining of his early life. It was a choice made in the dark, without any visible reward on the horizon, by a young man who had been trained for a world that no longer existed, and was, quite deliberately, choosing to build toward a world that might. He would spend the next decade doing exactly that, studying, qualifying, advancing through the grinding, unglamorous machinery of the interwar German military bureaucracy, earning each grade methodically, acquiring the staff skills that would one day make him, in the estimation of his superior officers, almost uniquely irreplaceable. He attended the Kriegsakademie, the German War Academy, beginning in October of 1934, the advanced program that produced Germany's general staff officers. He was selected, he excelled. He was, in other words, becoming something rare, a professional soldier in the fullest and most serious sense of the term. And as he climbed, step by careful step, the world outside the barracks was tilting. The Weimar Republic was struggling, a strange new political party, led by a decorated but erratic corporal from the First World War, was promising Germans the restoration of everything they had lost. By the time Walther Wenck graduated from the Kriegsakademie and was assigned to the staff of the newly formed Panzer forces, that party was already in power. Germany was rearming, and the road that would lead, eventually, to the bunker in Berlin was already being built. Chapter 2: The Making of a Staff Officer. Panzer Doctrine and the Art of the Possible. The German army that Walther Wenck joined as a professional staff officer in the mid-1930s was a different creature from the army he had entered in 1920. Versailles had restricted it, but restriction, paradoxically, had also refined it. The 100,000-man limit had forced a concentration of talent. Every officer slot was fiercely competed for, and the men who remained were, on the whole, among the most professionally committed soldiers in the world. And now, with the restrictions being openly discarded, and rearmament proceeding at speed, that concentrated corps was being asked to build something entirely new, a modern, mechanized army capable of the kind of rapid, decisive warfare that the old armies of the First World War had proven themselves incapable of imagining. Wenck's particular path ran through the emerging Panzer Arm, the armored force that would, within a few years, make the word blitzkrieg an international vocabulary word. In the 1930s, tanks were still deeply controversial. The experience of the First World War had produced two schools of thought: those who believed that tanks were essentially infantry support weapons, useful but secondary, and those, a smaller, more visionary group, who argued that armor, combined with motorized infantry and close air support, could punch through enemy lines and drive so deep and so fast that the enemy's entire command structure would collapse before it could respond. Wenck, assigned first to the staff of the Panzer Command and then to the Panzer Regiment itself, was shaped by the second school. In October of 1934, he began at the Kriegsakademie, the grinding, exacting, brilliant institution that produced Germany's general staff. The curriculum there went far beyond tactics. It required officers to think operationally, not just about how to win the fight in front of them, but about the logistical chains, the communications networks, the psychological pressures, the cascading second and third order effects that determined whether a campaign succeeded or collapsed. Wenck absorbed this curriculum with the same focused intensity he had brought to every previous challenge. He was not, by contemporary accounts, a charismatic figure in any theatrical sense. He did not inspire through spectacle. He inspired through competence, through the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had clearly thought harder about the problem than anyone else in the room. After completing the Kriegsakademie in October of 1936, he was assigned as a logistics and operations staff officer, the IB, to the command of the panzer troops, and later transferred formally into the general staff. In November of 1938, he took command of a company in the 2nd Panzer Regiment, his first direct command of fighting troops in a properly equipped unit. It was a grounding that many pure staff officers lacked, and it gave him something invaluable: the understanding of what an order actually looked like at the level of the man holding the rifle or gripping the tank commander's hatch. He knew the gap between what a map showed and what the ground felt like. On the 1st of April, 1939, 5 months before Germany invaded Poland and tore the world apart, Wenck was assigned as Chief of Operations for the 1st Panzer Division. He was 38 years old. The 1st Panzer was one of the most prestigious formations in the German army, a showpiece of the new armored doctrine, staffed with some of the most capable officers in the service. His role, as EA, was to translate the commander's intent into executable orders, to manage the flow of intelligence and logistics, to anticipate the operational problems before they became crises. It was, in many ways, the most intellectually demanding job in the division. The invasion of Poland in September of 1939 gave him his first test under fire and his first medals. He was awarded the Iron Cross of the 2nd Class on the 13th of September 1939 and the Iron Cross of the 1st Class 2 weeks later. Both awards were earned under combat conditions, which means they were not staff decorations. They required presence at the front, in the mess, and the noise of actual operations. What the Polish campaign showed Wenck, what it showed everyone paying attention, was that the armored doctrine worked. The speed of the German advance overwhelmed the Polish defenses, not primarily through superior numbers, but through tempo, through moving faster than the Polish command structure could adapt. Units that tried to hold fixed positions found themselves bypassed and encircled. The map was being rewritten in hours instead of days. For a staff officer who had spent years studying the operational theory behind this approach, watching it execute in real time must have felt like theory becoming physics. The campaign in the West the following spring, through Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and the Netherlands, gave him another dimension of experience. It also gave him another wound in the leg. He refused to leave his post. He continued to command. That detail, noted in his service record and in subsequent accounts, became part of the Wenck legend. Not the wound itself, but the refusal. It tells you something about the man. The job, in his calculation, was more important than his own comfort, or even his own safety. He was not performing courage for an audience. He was simply refusing to stop until the work was done. In the period from 1939 to 1942, his reputation grew steadily, operation by operation. He was the man the 1st Panzer Division relied on to think clearly under pressure, to solve problems that did not have textbook solutions, to build workable plans out of insufficient resources. Those 3 years, the Polish campaign, the Western campaign, the early months on the Eastern Front, were his operational education, paid for in exhaustion and uncertainty and the accumulated weight of decisions made in imperfect conditions. They were also, quietly, laying the foundation for everything that was to come. By the time Germany turned its full attention east, toward the Soviet Union, Walther Wenck had been shaped into a specific kind of officer, not a spectacular cavalry charge hero, not a political animal angling for proximity to power, but a professional problem solver with an unusual combination of staff brilliance and frontline credibility. The Eastern Front, which was about to consume and destroy more capable men than history can easily count, was going to need men like him very badly. And very soon, the crisis would be so severe that his name would begin appearing in conversations held at the very highest levels of the German command. Under there. Chapter 3. The Eastern Front. Into the grinding dark. Under. The Eastern Front was not a front in any sense that the word had previously meant. It was a continent-scaled catastrophe, a zone of operations stretching, at its widest, nearly 2,000 kilometers from north to south, across terrain that changed from Baltic marshland to Ukrainian steppe to Caucasian mountain in a single sweep of the map. The armies engaged on it were not merely large, they were the largest aggregations of military force in human history, burning through men and material at rates that challenged the accounting systems of both sides. And for a German general staff officer in the summer of 1942, when Walther Wenck was beginning his deep immersion in the Eastern Theatre, the fundamental problem was becoming increasingly legible. Germany had picked a fight it could not afford to sustain. Wenck's Eastern Front assignments unfolded in a rapid, disorienting sequence that was less a career progression than a crisis management relay race. From September of 1942, he served as Chief of Staff of the 57th Panzer Corps. Almost immediately, the strategic situation in the south deteriorated to a degree that exceeded anything the German command had planned for. November of 1942 brought the Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad, Operation Uranus, which encircled the German Sixth Army in a pocket that no one at senior command had believed possible. Wenck was reassigned in late November to the Chief of Staff role for the Third Romanian Army, one of Germany's Allied formations that had been ripped apart in the initial Soviet breakthrough. The Romanians had held a long sector of the front on the flanks of the Sixth Army, and when the Soviets struck those flanks simultaneously with overwhelming armored force, the line simply ceased to exist. What Wenck walked into at Third Romanian Army was not an organization responding to a crisis. It was, in military terms, the aftermath of a disintegration. Units were missing, communications had been severed, commanders had lost track of their own formations. His task, as Chief of Staff, was to rebuild command coherence out of chaos, to find the fragments, locate them on a map, establish communications, determine what could still be used, and construct something resembling a defensive line before the Soviet advance continued westward. He was doing this in winter, across terrain that punished movement, with resources that were demonstrably inadequate. He did it anyway. That competence, calm, methodical reconstruction of order from disorder, was the signature of his staff work throughout this period. By late December of 1942, he had been reassigned again, this time to the staff of Army Detachment Hollet, named after its commander, Karl Adolf Hollet, which was itself a formation assembled in emergency conditions to plug gaps in the collapsing southern front. This unit was eventually reorganized into the rebuilt Sixth Army after the original Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad in early 1943. Throughout these months, Wenck was functioning as an institutional anchor in a command system that was losing anchor points faster than they could be replaced. The loss of Stalingrad in February of 1943 was not merely a military defeat, it was a psychological earthquake that shook German command culture to its foundations. More than 250,000 men had been encircled, and for months the High Command had maintained, against all evidence, that relief was possible. When the end came, when the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered in the ruins of a demolished city, the certainty that Germany was invincible, that the Wehrmacht was an unstoppable machine, cracked permanently. Officers who had never before allowed themselves to doubt began doing so, quietly, in private conversations they would never commit to paper. Wenck's response to this was not recorded in any statement or diary, but his subsequent behavior suggests that he drew from it a particular kind of clarity, a soldier's refusal to comfort himself with fictions. He moved, in the spring of 1943, to the role of Chief of Staff of the 1st Panzer Army, one of the most important armored formations on the Eastern Front. In this capacity, he was operating at the level where strategy met operational reality, where the grand intentions of the High Command encountered the actual condition of roads, fuel supplies, weather, exhaustion, and enemy pressure. He was, by now, deeply expert at managing this collision. It was in this period that he first came to Adolf Hitler's personal attention in a memorable way. Summoned to present a briefing on the state of the Eastern Front, Wenck delivered his assessment with characteristic directness. The Eastern Front, he told Hitler, was like Swiss cheese, full of holes. It was informal language, the kind of blunt imagery that a man uses when he is tired of euphemism and wants to make himself absolutely understood. Hitler reprimanded him for the informality. Then, in a detail that says something important about how Hitler responded to a certain kind of bold competence, he praised the liveliness of the report. Wenck had impressed him. It was a dangerous thing to have done. On about the 22nd of July 1944, days after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler, which had left the Führer shaken, suspicious of his officer corps, and increasingly reliant on a shrinking circle of trusted figures, Heinz Guderian was appointed as Chief of Staff of the Army High Command, OKH. Guderian, one of the architects of armored warfare doctrine, understood immediately that he needed a chief of operations who could function under the extraordinary pressures of a command environment that was both militarily desperate and politically toxic. He chose Wenck. The boy general was brought to the center of the German war machine at precisely the moment when that machine was beginning to fail in ways that no amount of operational brilliance could repair. By this point, Wenck had spent 5 years absorbing the lessons of the most brutal conflict in human history. He had watched the German army at its triumphant peak in 1940, overrunning Western Europe with a confidence that seemed effortless. He had watched it begin its long, grinding degradation on the Eastern Front, the attrition of its best men, the shortening of its replacement pipeline, the widening gap between what the maps showed could be done and what the actual troops on the ground could actually do. He had no illusions, and the absence of illusions, in the apocalyptic closing months of the war, was both his most valuable asset and his most isolating burden. Chapter 4. The Wolf's Lair and the Weight of Knowing. OKO and the Collapsing War. Chapter 4. The building that housed the operational staff of the Army High Command in the autumn of 1944 was, in its physical appearance, ordinary, but inside it, extraordinary pressures were concentrated. The daily Führer briefings that had become extended, theatrical performances of self-delusion, the reports from the front that arrived already sanitized by the time they reached the highest levels, and, underneath all the noise, the quiet, relentless arithmetic of a war being lost by a nation that had not yet allowed itself to say so. Walther Wenck arrived into this environment in late July of 1944 as Chief of Operations, and he brought with him the one thing the place most desperately needed and most consistently punished: honest assessment. His role as Chief of Operations and, from the 1st of September 1944, Chief of the Command Staff, effectively Deputy Chief of the General Staff, required him to be present at the daily briefings. These were the sessions at which Hitler received updates from all theaters, asked questions, issued orders, and, increasingly, inhabited a strategic fantasy world in which German forces that existed only on paper were instructed to execute operations that the actual forces in the field could not begin to contemplate. Wenck was in the room for these sessions. He was, by definition, one of the men responsible for translating the orders that emerged from them into something the army could actually execute, which frequently meant navigating the gap between what had been commanded and what was physically possible. The autumn of 1944 was a season of cascading catastrophe. In the West, the Normandy landings had succeeded, Paris had been liberated, and Allied forces were pushing toward the German border. In the East, the Soviet summer offensives, Operation Bagration and its successors, had annihilated Army Group Center, in a destruction that historians have compared in scale to Stalingrad, except Stalingrad had consumed one army, and Bagration had consumed an army group. The numbers involved, the kilometers of ground lost, the divisions destroyed, the men killed, captured, or simply missing, were staggering. Germany was being compressed from both sides simultaneously. In this environment, the daily briefings at Hitler's headquarters became exercises in something that was difficult to name but unmistakable to anyone present. A ritual substitution of wishful thinking for operational planning. Divisions that existed only as names in a file were moved across maps. Counterattacks were ordered against Soviet forces that outnumbered the German formations facing them by ratios that no amount of German tactical skill could overcome. The language of these briefings, the confidence, the certainty, the refusal to acknowledge what the reports from the front were clearly showing, was, for a man of Wenck's professional formation, something close to surreal. He had spent his career learning to see clearly. He was now embedded in an institution that had made the decision to not see. He managed this tension the way good staff officers manage untenable situations, by doing what was possible within the space available, by finding ways to translate impossible orders into something approximating executable plans, by maintaining working relationships with the commanders in the field who were dealing with actual reality, and by keeping his own counsel. He did not, as far as can be determined, join any of the resistance circles that had culminated in the July 20th assassination attempt. His relationship to duty was professional and institutional, not political and conspiratorial. He had chosen to stay inside the system, and inside the system is where he worked. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, the compression was becoming existential. The Soviet forces were driving into eastern Prussia. The Western Allied forces had been temporarily stalled, but were regrouping after the German offensive in the Ardennes, an operation that had consumed Germany's last strategic armored reserve for a gain that proved temporary. The final arithmetic was becoming legible to anyone with access to accurate data, which, by this point, meant almost no one in the Führer's immediate circle, and almost everyone in the field. In this period, something occurred that would prove to be one of the most significant events of Wenck's career, not for what it achieved militarily, but for what it revealed about the system he was operating within. Heinz Guderian, his superior and sponsor, spent several weeks in late January and early February of 1945, attempting to persuade Hitler to transfer significant forces from other theaters to stabilize the Eastern Front, which was on the verge of total collapse. Hitler refused, repeatedly, and directed his attention instead to a counterattack, a last, desperate attempt to seize initiative on the Pomeranian section of the front. This operation would be called Sonnenwende, Operation Solstice. Guderian persuaded Hitler to put Wenck in command of the operation, reasoning that the only officer capable of extracting any usable result from the available resources was the one he trusted most professionally. On the 13th of February, 1945, as Allied bombers were reducing the historic city of Dresden to rubble in 2 catastrophic nights of raids, Wenck took command of the forces assigned to Sonnenwende. The operation was critically compromised from the start. The forces assigned were a fraction of what was needed. Logistical support was insufficient. Fuel shortages, ammunition shortfalls, transport problems. The Soviet forces opposite had intelligence of the attack and were prepared. Nevertheless, in the opening days, Wenck's handling of the operation achieved limited local successes, probing gains that suggested, under different conditions, what might have been possible. But the conditions were not different. They were what they were, The Soviet response was swift and overwhelming, and by the 18th of February, the operation had effectively ended in German defeat. But Wenck never saw the end of it. Hitler had demanded that he attend the daily Führer briefings, requiring a round trip of roughly 320 kilometers every day, a journey that consumed hours and exhausted the men making it. On the 17th of February 1945, after one of these journeys, Wenck's driver, a man named Dorn, collapsed from exhaustion at the wheel. Wenck took over. He was desperately tired himself. Somewhere on a dark road in the German countryside, with the war consuming everything around him, his eyes closed. The car left the road and struck a bridge railing. Dorn survived. Wenck was pulled from the wreck with a fractured skull and 5 broken ribs. He would spend the next 6 weeks in hospital. During those weeks, the last pieces of Germany's strategic defense collapsed one by one. When he emerged from his recovery, thin, still healing, walking carefully, it was into a world that had changed in ways even his hard-trained realism had not fully anticipated. And the next role, waiting for him, would be the most impossible assignment any soldier in that war had been asked to carry. Underscore. Chapter 5. Born from Wreckage. The Twelfth Army and the Myth of Salvation. Underscore. On the 10th of April 1945, Walther Wenck was given command of the German 12th Army. He was 44 years old, still recovering from his injuries, and the army he was given was, in most meaningful senses of the term, not yet an army. It was an organizational idea, a command structure built around formations that were themselves being assembled from fragments, training units pulled from schools, officer candidates who had been weeks away from graduation, remnants of divisions that had been ground down on other fronts, and men drawn from support branches who had spent the war maintaining equipment rather than operating it in combat. The 12th Army existed, at its creation, as a command structure in search of forces, occupying terrain between Berlin and the advancing American and British armies to the west. The strategic rationale for its creation was, at least on paper, defensive. Germany was being compressed from both sides, and the Western Front, the line against the American and British armies, still needed to be held. The 12th Army was placed to the west of Berlin, oriented westward, facing the forces under American General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. As long as this defensive rationale held, Wenck's task was difficult but defined. Slow the Western advance, buy time, use the terrain intelligently. It was the kind of problem he had been trained for, managing a defense with insufficient resources against an overwhelming force, finding ways to cost the attacker time and men without committing to fights that could not be won. But there was another dimension to the 12th Army's situation that no order had created and no command structure had anticipated: the refugees. As the Soviet armies swept westward through eastern Germany, they displaced populations on a scale that had few precedents in modern European history. Millions of Germans were moving, on foot, in carts, in whatever transport could be commandeered, away from the advancing Red Army and toward whatever safety the West might offer. The roads and forests in the rear area of Wenck's army had become a vast, semi-organized migration. Wenck saw this and made a decision that was not in any order he had received. He directed his army to feed them. According to records and witness accounts from the period, the 12th Army was, at one stage, providing food and some degree of shelter to more than 250,000 people every single day. Civilians, families, elderly men and women, children, who had nothing to do with military operations, but who were, by the terrible logic of the moment, dependent on the military for survival. The decision to accept this responsibility was not strategically cost-free. It diverted resources. It complicated logistics. It created a human burden on an army that was already operating under enormous pressure. But Wenck made it, apparently without much internal conflict, because it was what was in front of him. The people were there. He had food. The arithmetic was simple. He would later be quoted as having said that the task of his army had, by that point, little to do with military objectives and everything to do with keeping people alive. The transformation from instrument of a state to refuge from a state was, in retrospect, one of the more remarkable quiet shifts in the entire final chapter of the war. On the 21st of April, 1945, Hitler ordered SS General Felix Steiner to attack the forces of Soviet Marshal Zhukov from the north. Steiner's formation, grandly titled Army Detachment Steiner, had, in reality, few operational tanks and roughly a single division's worth of infantry. He assessed the order as impossible, refused to execute it in its original form, and instead began retreating. This was, for Hitler, a shattering blow. He had built his entire final defensive plan around a series of formations that existed on maps more completely than they existed on the ground. Each time reality failed to match the map, and reality was failing to match the map with increasing frequency, his responses oscillated between rage and a kind of manic reinvention, as if by issuing a new order with sufficient force, he could compel geography and arithmetic to comply. The next day, the 22nd of April, Hitler held the briefing that most historians identify as the moment when his complete psychological disintegration became publicly visible. When told that Steiner's attack had not occurred, that the Army Detachment Steiner had in fact retreated, Hitler erupted in a sustained, hours-long explosion of accusation and self-pity that shocked even the men who had witnessed his rages before. The war, he announced, was lost. This admission, wrenched from him by a reality he could no longer deny, was followed almost immediately by its opposite, the declaration that he would stay in Berlin, fight to the end, and that the city would be saved. The mechanism of salvation, in this new iteration, was Wenck. On the afternoon of the 22nd of April, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel was sent southwest of Berlin to find Wenck's headquarters and deliver Hitler's personal order. The 12th Army was to disengage from the Americans, turn its back on the Western Front, and drive east. Drive through the Soviet forces encircling Berlin, link up with General Theodor Buss's 9th Army, which was itself trapped in a pocket southeast of the capital. Together, they would break the encirclement. Together, they would save Berlin. Wenck received this order. He studied it. He was a general staff officer of the first rank, trained for decades in the precise art of assessing what was operationally possible. He would have understood, within minutes of reading the order, that the mathematical gap between what was being asked and what his army could do was not a gap that could be bridged by determination or improvisation or any other quality that he or his men possessed in any quantity. The Soviet forces encircling Berlin included not just Zhukov's armies from the north and east, but Konev's First Ukrainian Front sweeping around from the south. A combined force of staggering size, experienced, equipped, and operating in terrain they had been planning to fight over for months. The 12th Army, assembled from fragments and occupied with feeding 250,000 refugees, was being asked to break this ring open from outside. He gave the order to move east. He would later say, and his subsequent actions would confirm, that he never believed Berlin could be saved. The eastward movement of the 12th Army was, from the beginning, not an attempt to relieve the capital. It was an attempt to open a corridor, wide enough for people to move through, sustained long enough for as many as possible to get across the Elbe before the Soviets closed it. The distinction matters enormously. An army moving to save a city follows different principles from an army moving to create a human escape route. Wenck was doing the second thing, while operating under orders that described the first. Underther. Chapter 6. The Drive East. Reality against orders. Soldier against state. Underscore. The eastward movement of the 12th Army in late April of 1945 was, in its externals, a military offensive. It had the form of an attack. Orders issued, formations deployed, axes of advance established, objectives named. But in its substance, in the understanding that Wenck carried with him as he directed it from the front, it was something different. It was a calculated act of redirection, the use of military form to accomplish a humanitarian purpose that no order had authorized, and that the man who had issued the relevant orders would not have approved. Understanding this distinction is essential to understanding why Walther Wenck became, in the years after the war, one of the very few senior German officers whose memory was treated, even by his former enemies, with a degree of respect that bordered on admiration. His forces attacked toward Berlin in the general direction of Potsdam. In the opening days, they made some progress, not the sweeping advance that Hitler's briefings were no doubt describing in the bunker, but real, costly movement through Soviet lines that demonstrated that the 12th Army, for all its improvised origins, had genuine fighting capacity. The men had been told, by Wenck himself, what the real mission was. He had not wrapped it in the language of National Socialist ideology, or in the rhetoric of final victory. He had been direct with his officers, and, through them, with his men. They were not going to save the Reich. The Reich was beyond saving. They were going to try to keep a passage open. They were going to try to get people out. By the 27th of April, however, the 12th Army's attack had been halted outside Potsdam by Soviet resistance that the available forces simply could not overcome. At the same time, the 9th Army, the formation that was supposed to link up with Wenck and form the combined force that Hitler's plan required, was trapped in the Halbe pocket, fighting for its survival in the forests south of Berlin, unable to break out cleanly toward Wenck's positions. General Theodor Busse, commanding the 9th Army, was making his own desperate calculations, his own redirection of impossible orders towards survivable outcomes. On the 24th of April, the first attempts were made to break out of the Halbe pocket, the forested killing ground where the remnants of the 9th Army and tens of thousands of civilian refugees found themselves encircled by Soviet forces that had closed the ring around Berlin. The fighting in those forests was extraordinarily costly, by any measure. More than 40,000 men died in and around Halbe in the final days of April and the first days of May, a figure that speaks to the ferocity of Soviet determination to prevent the breakthrough and the desperation of the German forces attempting it. Wenck, aware of the 9th Army's situation, turned a portion of his own forces south to try to punch toward them, not to fuel some renewed offensive toward Berlin, but to widen the corridor, to give the men and civilians streaming out of the pocket a route west. Some of those routes held. Fragments of the 9th Army, exhausted, reduced, but alive, began fighting their way through toward Wenck's lines. With them came civilians, people who had been living in terror, sheltering in the forests, following any movement that seemed to be moving away from the Red Army. Throughout this period, Wenck was broadcasting radio messages toward the encircled forces, messages that combined military coordination with something that sounded almost personal. The most widely cited of these transmissions is the one that has been remembered, in various paraphrases, as, "Comrades, you've got to go in once more. It's not about Berlin anymore. It's not about the Reich anymore." Whether those were the precise words transmitted is impossible to verify with certainty. Radio communications in combat conditions rarely survive verbatim, but the substance is confirmed by multiple accounts, and it captures something true about the texture of the moment. A general speaking to soldiers, not in the language of ideology or command, but in the language of shared human urgency. He was not asking them to fight for a state. He was asking them to fight for each other and for the people behind them. On the night of the 28th of April, Wenck transmitted a report to the German Supreme Army Command at Fürstenberg. His message was unambiguous. His army had been forced back along the entire front. Support from Busse's 9th Army could no longer be expected. No attack on Berlin was possible. He was stating, in formal military language, what the situation actually was. Not what Hitler's headquarters wanted to hear, not what the briefings in the bunker required, but the facts as they existed on the ground, assembled by trained observers using verified information. It was the kind of report that, throughout the previous year, had gotten officers relieved of their commands. Wenck submitted it because it was true, and because the truth, at that moment, was the only operational basis for any decision that might still save lives. The days that followed were not a retreat in any tactical sense. They were an organized extraction, a deliberate movement west toward the Elbe, with Wenck's own formations providing whatever covering force could be managed. The bridge at Tangermünde became the focal point, a partially destroyed crossing that armies and civilians alike were converging on, trying to get across before the Soviets could close it. Between the 4th and the 7th of May, roughly 25,000 German soldiers from the 9th Army remnants crossed into American-held territory. With them came an estimated number of civilians. The specific figure remains contested by historians, with accounts varying between tens of thousands and 250,000, who had been caught up in the eastward corridor that Wenck had opened and then shepherded westward. Wenck himself was one of the last to cross. His boat came under fire from Soviet forces as he attempted to reach the western bank. 2 of his officers were wounded in the crossing, one fatally. He made it. He was captured by American forces shortly afterward. The date was, depending on the account, around the 7th of May 1945, the same day Germany signed the Instruments of Unconditional Surrender. The war in Europe was ending. The boy general had, in the end, done the one thing left available to him. He had kept as many people alive as the situation allowed, and he had crossed the Elbe. Behind him, Berlin had already fallen. In the bunker, Hitler had asked his last question about Wenck's army on the night of the 29th to 30th of April. Where are the advanced parts of the Wenck? Before taking his own life the following afternoon. The answer to his question was the Elbe River, but Wenck's army was not advancing toward Berlin. It never had been, not in any sense that Hitler had intended. It had been moving, from the moment it turned east, in a direction that only one man, with the maps, the intelligence, and the honest professional judgment to read them, could have charted, toward the only objective that was still achievable, the preservation of human life in a war that had consumed so much of it. The last act of the 12th Army was not a military victory. It was something quieter and, in many ways, more difficult. It was the performance of duty redefined by a man who had been trained for war, survived it, and in its last hours chose to use the machinery of war to accomplish what the state had long since ceased to care about, keeping people alive. Chapter 7. The Bunker World. Orders from Underground. While Walther Wenck was moving his army through dark pine forests and broken roads, trying to thread a human corridor between 2 converging superpowers, Adolf Hitler was underground. The Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancery Garden in Berlin was not a large structure. It was a compressed, low-ceilinged series of rooms that smelled of diesel fuel and damp concrete, lit by artificial light at all hours, because it had no windows, no sky, no reference to the world above. The men and women who worked and lived inside it had been cut off from ordinary reality for weeks, and the effect on collective psychology was precisely what that kind of isolation produces, an increasingly closed loop of assumption and self-confirmation, where the maps on the table and the voices in the room became the only available version of the world. Outside, Berlin was burning. Inside, The briefings continued. The daily situation conferences in the bunker had, by the final week of April 1945, taken on a character that several of those present would describe, in later testimony and memoir, as deeply disorienting. Hitler had aged dramatically in the preceding months. The tremor in his left hand had become pronounced, his posture had deteriorated, and the confident theatricality of his earlier public manner had contracted into something more volatile and unpredictable. He moved between extremes, moments of absolute certainty that the situation could be reversed, and moments of sudden, terrible clarity in which he acknowledged that the war was lost, only to reverse that acknowledgement within hours and insist again on operations that bore no relationship to available forces. The generals around him had learned, painfully, that both these states required careful navigation, the certainty no less than the despair. The cast of people surrounding Hitler in the bunker's final phase included figures whose names would later be permanently associated with the war's catastrophic end. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the Supreme Commander's chief military assistant, described by those who knew him as a man who had sacrificed professional judgment entirely on the altar of personal loyalty. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations of the Wehrmacht High Command, more cerebral than Keitel, but equally committed to avoiding any confrontation with Hitler's decisions. Martin Bormann, the party secretary, who controlled access to Hitler and used that control to shape what the dictator heard and from whom he heard it. And Generals Hans Krebs and Wilhelm Burgdorf, who had been assigned to Hitler's personal staff and were, by this point, as trapped underground as anyone else. None of these men were capable of delivering the kind of honest operational assessment that Wenck had been providing from the field. That capacity had been systematically selected out of the bunker. The situation briefings themselves were, by late April, being conducted against a background of information that had been so thoroughly filtered by the time it reached the briefing room that it bore only a fractured relationship to events on the surface. Reports from field commanders were received, revised at intermediate headquarters, revised again before they reached the bunker, and then further adjusted by the men presenting them to account for Hitler's known reactions to bad news, which were explosive and personal, directed at whoever was present, rather than at whatever actual failure had produced the situation. The incentive structure for honest reporting had been completely inverted. Officers who delivered accurate bad news were accused of defeatism, sometimes relieved, sometimes worse. Officers who delivered optimistic distortions were rewarded with continued access. The result was a command system that was, in its most critical moment, running almost entirely on fantasy. On the 22nd of April, the collapse of Steiner's attack triggered the scene that many historians treat as the decisive psychological rupture. Hitler's rage lasted for hours. It was witnessed by Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, Burgdorf, and several aides, as well as by the stenographers whose job it was to record these sessions. What is most striking about the accounts, beyond the immediate drama, is the context. Hitler was not wrong that Steiner had failed to execute the attack as ordered. He was, however, fundamentally mistaken about why. The failure was not a product of cowardice or treachery, as he insisted, but of the simple fact that Army Detachment Steiner was a formation of maybe 10 to 12,000 men being ordered to attack Soviet positions defended by forces several times that size. The attack could not succeed because the resources necessary for its success did not exist. But in Hitler's accounting, the resources existed. He had ordered them into being, and the failure to execute was therefore a personal betrayal. This was the epistemological world inside which the order to send Wenck east was generated. When Keitel was dispatched from the bunker on the afternoon of the 22nd of April to find Wenck's headquarters and deliver Hitler's personal order to march on Berlin, he was carrying with him the complete unreality of the bunker world, into the actual world of mud and exhaustion and insufficient ammunition and roads full of refugees. Keitel found Wenck. He delivered the order. Wenck listened. According to accounts from officers present at the meeting, Wenck received the order with the controlled, attentive posture of a professional soldier in the presence of a superior, gave no indication of the assessment forming in his mind, and waited until Keitel had departed. What happened in the following hours? The quiet conversations with his own staff, the planning sessions, the orders that began to take shape, reflects a man who had already understood the gap between what was being ordered and what was possible, and had made his peace with how he was going to bridge it. He would move east, but not in the way Hitler imagined. From this point forward, the bunker and the field were operating in parallel, but disconnected realities. In the bunker, the radio traffic from Wenck's army was being interpreted through the lens of the briefings. Each advance, however limited, was amplified. Each report of difficulty was minimized or reinterpreted. Hitler asked about Wenck repeatedly in the final days. The question, "Where is Wenck?" was relayed to the field, and the answers that came back were honest ones, that described a military situation incompatible with any rescue of Berlin. Those honest answers did not, apparently, arrive in the bunker in a form recognizable enough to interrupt the fantasy. The briefings continued, the maps were updated, and in the pine forests between Berlin and the Elbe, Wenck's army was doing something altogether different from what was being discussed underground. The bunker's isolation had another effect that is worth considering. It separated Hitler entirely from the human reality of what was happening to the population of Berlin and the surrounding territory. The millions of civilians caught in the battle area, people sheltering in cellars, people streaming west on roads under artillery fire, people dying in fires set by incendiary rounds, were not present in any meaningful sense in the briefing room. The strategic discussions were conducted in the language of divisions and corps, kilometers and objectives, without a corresponding language for the human beings those abstractions were made of. Wenck, by contrast, had been living with those human beings. He had been feeding them. He had watched them on the roads and in the fields of his army's rear area. They were not an abstraction to him. This difference between the bunker's dehumanized geometry and the field army's grounded proximity to actual people is perhaps the deepest explanation for why Wenck and Hitler arrived at such entirely different answers to the same situation. By the 26th of April, the Soviet encirclement of Berlin was complete. Zhukov's forces, driving from the north and east, had linked up with Konev's forces sweeping from the south, closing the ring around the city and around whatever German forces were still inside it. The garrison of Berlin, a mixture of regular soldiers, Waffen-SS units, Volkssturm Home Guard formations of old men and boys, and Hitler Youth members, armed with anti-tank weapons, was now fighting a siege defense against armies that had been preparing for this moment for months. The city itself was being systematically destroyed, not in the abstract sense that planners use the word, but in the concrete, specific sense. Buildings collapsing, streets becoming rubble fields, water and power systems failing, medical facilities overwhelmed. And in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, the bunker held. The final days of the bunker produced the scenes that have been reconstructed so many times in subsequent decades that they have acquired a kind of strange familiarity. The marriage ceremony on the 28th of April, the political testament dictated in the early hours of the 29th, the final radio message to Keitel asking where Wenck was, the silence that answered it. In those last hours, Hitler transmitted what he believed was a strategic question about military operations. In reality, he was asking whether rescue was coming. The answer was the Elbe River. It was not the answer he was looking for, but it was the only answer that the actual world, as opposed to the briefing room world, had left to give. Alle, Undercore, Naughty. Chapter 8. The Halber Pocket. Forests and the Weight of Escape. Underscore. Southeast of Berlin, in the spring forests around the village of Halber, something was happening that no map in the Führerbunker adequately captured. The German Ninth Army, the formation that Hitler's plan required to link up with Wenck's 12th Army and together break the Soviet encirclement of Berlin, had itself been encircled. Cut off by the converging Soviet forces that had swept around the southern approaches to the capital, the Ninth Army and the tens of thousands of civilians who had attached themselves to its retreating columns found themselves compressed into a shrinking forest pocket, Soviet artillery and infantry closing in from all sides, the roads behind them blocked, the roads ahead contested. The Halbe pocket was, by the time the fighting began in earnest around the 24th of April, one of the most densely human pieces of ground in Europe. General Theodor Busse, commanding the Ninth Army, was a different figure from Wenck, more conventionally military in his bearing, less of the staff intellectual, more the combat commander. He had spent the war on the Eastern Front, in command roles that had given him an intimate and unromantic education in Soviet fighting power. He understood, with complete clarity, that his army could not stay where it was. The pocket was being compressed. Supply was exhausted. The men were using ammunition they had stripped from the dead. The civilians in the forests, families, elderly people, wounded soldiers from earlier fighting, had no food, no shelter beyond the trees, and no protection from the artillery rounds that fell with increasing frequency as the Soviet forces tightened the ring. Busse had one viable course of action: break out west, toward Wenck. The breakout attempts began on the 24th of April and continued in successive surges over the following days. The fighting in the Halbe forests was of a character that defies easy description in terms of conventional military operations. It was not a battle with clear lines or defined objectives, but a grinding, disorienting struggle in dense woodland where visibility was measured in tens of meters, where columns mixed with each other and with civilian groups, where the noise of artillery and small arms fire came from multiple directions simultaneously, and there was no reliable way to determine, from the inside, which direction was actually west. The forests that might have offered concealment and cover also offered disorientation. Men died in the trees, without knowing which way the safety of Wenck's lines lay. The scale of loss at Halbe, with estimates of those killed ranging widely, but the most commonly cited figures, placing the number somewhere around 40,000, reflects the ferocity of the Soviet containment effort and the desperate nature of the breakout attempts. Soviet commanders were under pressure of their own. The race between Zhukov and Konev to be first into Berlin had been generating intense competitive pressure throughout the entire Berlin operation, and neither front commander wanted to be associated with a significant German escape that might be construed as a failure of encirclement. The forces tasked with maintaining the Halbe pocket were therefore substantial, well-equipped, and highly motivated to prevent exactly what Wenck was trying to facilitate: the passage of significant numbers of German soldiers and civilians through the ring and into American-held territory. Wenck had turned a corps-sized force southward from his main axis of advance toward Berlin, aiming to punch toward the Halbe area and create enough pressure on the Soviet containment lines to allow the Ninth Army fragments to filter through. This was not the operation Hitler's orders described. It was not a relief of Berlin. It was a calculated use of the 12th Army's remaining combat power to open and maintain a human escape route in the only direction that offered any survivable outcome: westward, toward the Americans. The decision required Wenck to accept that Berlin was being abandoned, not verbally, not in any formal sense, but operationally, in the way that armies communicate through the direction their forces are pointed. He pointed them west, and the act of pointing was the decision. The nights in the Halbe forests during the last days of April were extraordinary, not in any aesthetic sense, but in their raw human density. Soldiers who survived described columns of thousands of people, military and civilian, intermingled, moving through darkness under fire, guided by the sound of fighting to the west, where Wenck's forces were working to hold the corridor open. Men carried wounded comrades. Families moved in groups, holding on to each other to avoid being separated in the dark. Children who had been separated from their parents were absorbed into whatever group was nearest and moving. The breakdown of formal structure, the dissolution of military hierarchy, and civilian social order under extreme duress produced something that was simultaneously terrifying and, in small individual instances, deeply human. Strangers deciding to keep each other alive. Wenck's radio transmissions during this period were directed not at Berlin and not at the High Command, but at the men in the pocket. The substance of those messages, urging movement, indicating the axis west, coordinating the timing of the corridor's maintenance, carried within them a different kind of military communication than the orders that had been flowing in the other direction for months. They were not about objectives or lines on a map. They were about where people needed to move to stay alive, delivered by a commander who had accepted personal responsibility for the outcome. The men receiving those transmissions were, in many cases, beyond the point where military hierarchy had any functional meaning. What they were responding to was something more basic, the presence, on the other side of the forest, of someone who was actually coming toward them. By the 26th and 27th of April, fragments of the 9th Army were beginning to reach Wenck's lines. The breakthrough was never clean. It was never the organized, formation-preserving operation that a different situation might have allowed. It was ragged, costly, piecemeal. Units arrived in groups of dozens, or hundreds rather than thousands. They arrived without much of their heavy equipment, without coherent unit integrity, sometimes without their commanders. But they arrived alive, and with them came civilians, people who had been sheltering in the Halbe forests, who had attached themselves to whatever military column seemed to be moving towards safety, who had no military standing, but who had made the calculation, correctly, that Wenck's army was the nearest available definition of help. The handling of these arrivals, the absorption of thousands of people in a state of extreme physical and psychological exhaustion into the logistics and movement structure of an army that was itself under pressure, required a kind of institutional flexibility that most military organizations are not designed for. Wenck's army managed it, imperfectly, but adequately, because Wenck had already established, weeks earlier with the refugee populations in his rear area, the internal culture and physical infrastructure for exactly this kind of absorption. The army had already become, in a real sense, a shelter. The addition of the 9th Army survivors and their accompanying civilians was an intensification of something already underway. It was still, in the conventional military sense of the term, a catastrophe, but within the catastrophe, there was organization, there was food, there was a direction to move in, there was, in other words, Wenck. On the 28th of April, after the last significant breakout attempt from Halbe had either succeeded or failed with irreversible finality, Busse himself led what remained of his army's command structure westward through the corridor. The forests behind them were full of the dead. The forests ahead of them were contested. Between the two, tens of thousands of people were moving in the dark toward a river they could not yet see, moving because a general they had mostly never met had decided, against the orders he had received and against any calculation of personal advantage, that keeping them moving was the only thing left worth doing. Chapter 9. The Elbe, a river between two worlds. The Elbe River, in late April and early May of 1945 had become one of the most significant geographical features in the world. It was not large by the standards of the great rivers of Russia or America. It was wide enough to require a bridge, narrow enough to be crossed by a determined swimmer in calmer conditions. But in the final week of the war in Europe, it functioned as something far larger than its physical dimensions. It was the boundary between the American zone of advance and the Soviet zone, a line that two of the most powerful military forces in human history had, by mutual arrangement, agreed not to cross each other's side of. East of the Elbe was Soviet, west of the Elbe was American, and for every German soldier and civilian trying to escape the Eastern catastrophe, the Elbe was, quite literally, the border between survival and capture. Wenck understood this. His entire operational logic in the closing days of April and the opening days of May was oriented around the Elbe, specifically around the bridge at Tangermünde, one of the few crossing points still functional, and the fords and boat crossings available at other points along his army's line of westward movement. The 12th Army's axis had shifted, gradually and then decisively, from east toward Berlin to west toward the Elbe. This reorientation was not accompanied by any formal announcement or change of orders from above. It was accomplished in the operational language of actual troop movements, logistical priorities, and the direction commanders pointed their formations. Wenck had, in effect, quietly cancelled Hitler's order through the medium of geography and replaced it with an order of his own that he had issued to no one but himself. The bridge at Tangermünde was the pivot of everything. American forces under the broader command of General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group had reached the Elbe at multiple points in mid-April, but had halted there in accordance with the agreements reached between the Allied powers about the boundaries of advance. The Americans were not to push further east, into what was designated as the Soviet zone of occupation. They were waiting. And on the western bank of the river, the Americans watched with a combination of military caution and evident human sympathy as the bridge and the fords around it began to carry an extraordinary human cargo. German soldiers, many of them in the tattered remnants of uniforms, and civilians, in whatever clothing they had been wearing when the order to move came, crossing the river and entering American custody. The Americans did not turn them back. The crossing operations lasted, in their most intense phase, from around the 30th of April through the 7th of May. The bridge at Tangermünde had been partially destroyed by this point. It had been blown by retreating German forces in an earlier phase of the fighting and was not fully repaired. People crossed on whatever was available, the bridge's remaining walkable sections, small boats commandeered from the river's banks, improvised rafts. The movement was continuous, day and night, pressed urgently forward by the knowledge that Soviet forces were advancing from the east, and that the window would not stay open. Every hour that the crossing remained possible was an hour in which more people could get across. Every hour that Soviet forces drew closer was an hour that reduced the margin. The numbers that crossed the Elbe through Wenck's corridor during this period remain a subject of historical discussion. Estimates for military personnel range around 25,000 soldiers from the 9th Army remnants, along with components of the 12th Army itself. Estimates for civilians are substantially less precise, with figures cited in various historical accounts ranging from the tens of thousands to a number approaching 250,000. The upper figure, possibly including people who had been in the 12th Army's rear area refugee population throughout the preceding weeks, not all of whom crossed directly at Tangermünde. What is not in dispute is that the scale was significant, that the crossings were organized and enabled by Wenck's decision to move his army west rather than continue pressing east toward Berlin, and that the people who crossed owed their subsequent survival, in whole or in part, to that decision. The Americans who received the crossing Germans were, by all contemporary accounts, professional and humane. The formal military process was surrender and capture. The Germans who crossed were technically prisoners of war, but the conditions of their reception were, especially given the immediate alternative on the eastern bank, more than adequate. They were fed, they were processed, they were, in most cases, treated according to the conventions of military captivity that Germany's own treatment of Soviet prisoners had so catastrophically violated. The contrast was not lost on the German soldiers who made the crossing. Several of those who survived to leave accounts mentioned it specifically, the shock of being treated, after years inside a system that had normalized dehumanization in multiple directions, with ordinary procedural decency. The Soviet response to the crossings was a combination of artillery fire and infantry pressure that, in the final days, was clearly designed to close the corridor before it could be fully exploited. Soviet forces pursued the retreating German formations toward the Elbe, and the crossings in the last days occurred under active fire. Wenck's rearguard forces, the units assigned to hold the eastern bank long enough for the last crossings to be completed, were absorbing Soviet attacks, while the movement continued behind them. These were soldiers holding ground they knew they could not hold indefinitely, for a purpose that was no longer military in any conventional sense. They were buying time in minutes and hours so that people behind them could get across a river. The moral weight of that position, covering a withdrawal that was fundamentally a civilian evacuation, knowing that capture by the advancing Soviet forces was the alternative, was not recorded in any document. It was carried by the men who held the line. Wenck himself maintained his command until the last possible moment. His headquarters moved progressively westward as the eastern bank became untenable, and he was directing the crossing operations personally, coordinating the rear guard and the crossing simultaneously, the way a man manages a fire door, holding it open as long as the last person is still coming through. The moment he crossed himself, in a boat, under fire, losing 2 officers in the process, was not a retreat, but a completion. The job he had defined for himself, which was not the job his orders described, was done, or as done as the situation allowed. The bridge at Tangermünde had served its purpose. The Elbe had been crossed. The corridor had been held for as long as it could be held. The German capitulation was coming. On the 7th of May, at Rams, Germany signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender. On the 8th of May, designated Victory in Europe Day in the West, the war officially ended. Wenck was already in American custody. He had crossed the Elbe. Elbe surrendered to American forces and been processed as a prisoner of war. His army, the force assembled from fragments in April, fed 250,000 refugees for weeks, driven east in nominal compliance with an order it had never genuinely intended to execute, and then turned west to accomplish the only thing left worth accomplishing, had ceased to exist as a military formation. It had dissolved at the river, its people dispersed into American captivity on one bank and Soviet encirclement on the other. What remained of it was not an army, but a story. And stories, unlike armies, are very difficult to destroy. Under Chapter 10, Captivity, Interrogation, and the Silence of a Professional, _. The transition from active command to prisoner of war is, for any senior officer, one of the most psychologically disorienting experiences a military career can produce. The entire structure that has given meaning to daily existence, command responsibility, operational decision-making, the constant pressure of events that require response, simply stops. In its place is waiting, and procedural submission to a system you have no role in shaping. For a man of Wenck's particular formation, a professional whose entire identity had been organized around the exercise of operational judgment, the enforced passivity of captivity must have created a silence of a very specific quality, He had, after all, just come from one of the most compressed periods of decision-making in any officer's career. Now there was nothing to decide except how to answer questions. The American interrogators who processed Wenck in the days following his surrender were, by the conventions of the period, primarily interested in operational intelligence, the disposition of German forces, the state of German supply lines, the technical capabilities of German equipment. By early May of 1945, most of this information was of limited immediate value, since the war in Europe was ending, or had ended, but the systematic extraction of German military knowledge had been a priority throughout the conflict, and the habit of doing so did not stop with the surrender. Wenck was a significant figure, one of the most senior and operationally important German generals to come into American hands, and he would have been interrogated by qualified officers who understood what questions to ask. What Wenck told his interrogators, and how he told it, is not fully documented in publicly available sources. What subsequent accounts suggest, both from the American side and from German officers who knew him, is that he was cooperative in the factual sense and non-political in every other sense. He described what had happened. He described the military situation as he had assessed it. He did not, apparently, seek to justify himself in ideological terms or to frame his actions within the larger narrative of the regime he had served. He was a professional soldier who had made professional decisions, and he described them in professional language. The actions he had taken in the final weeks, the redirection toward the Elbe, the rescue of civilians and soldiers, were described not as heroism, but as the only operationally rational response to the situation that had existed. The broader context of German prisoner interrogation in the summer and autumn of 1945 was shaped by what the Allies were finding as they moved through the liberated territories. The concentration camps, the evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale, the documentary record of decisions taken at the highest levels of the German state. The Nuremberg trials were being prepared. The question of command responsibility, who knew what, who ordered what, who could have stopped what and chose not to, was being subjected to a legal and historical scrutiny that would occupy decades of scholarship. Senior German military officers were being assessed not merely as prisoners of war, but as potential defendants or witnesses in one of the most significant judicial proceedings in history. Wenck's conduct in this environment was, by all accounts, composed and careful without being evasive. He was not called as a defendant at Nuremberg. The specific nature of his wartime service, a staff officer and operational commander whose record contained no documented involvement in the criminal aspects of the regime's conduct, placed him outside the categories that the prosecution was primarily concerned with. He was held in captivity for a period extending beyond the formal end of hostilities, as were many senior German officers whose knowledge was of continuing interest or whose status required careful processing before being released. The date of his release is variously given in different sources, as sometime in 1946, when the majority of the senior German officer corps that had not been tried was being systematically demobilized from captivity. The experience of captivity, however brief in historical terms, had a particular quality for German officers of Wenck's generation and rank that deserves consideration. They had entered the war as officers of a great power. They had served in the most destructive conflict in human history. They had watched Germany lose, not in the slow, debatable way of 1918, but in a total, unambiguous, territorial, and moral collapse, from which there was no dignified extraction possible. The state they had served had, it was becoming clear with each week of the occupation, committed crimes on a scale that defied ordinary moral accounting. The relationship of the professional soldier, the man who had told himself he was serving Germany, not the party, not the ideology, not the regime. To those crimes was a question that every surviving German officer had to navigate, in private and eventually in public. Wenck's navigation of this question appears to have been marked by the same quality that characterized his military career, the refusal of comfortable fictions. He did not, as far as can be determined, adopt the post-war strategy common among some German officers of claiming total ignorance of the regime's crimes. He also did not seek to construct a retrospective narrative of resistance that his actual conduct did not support. He had served. He had made the decisions available to him within the system he was part of. The decision at the Elbe to move his army west rather than east, to use the 12th Army to keep people alive rather than expend it in a hopeless attack, was the decision he had made, and it was the decision that would define his reputation. He appeared in subsequent accounts to accept this without elaboration or excessive self-congratulation. The silence that surrounded Wenck in the years immediately after his release was not the silence of a man hiding something. It was the silence of a man who had said what he needed to say through his actions, and was now, in a devastated and occupied Germany, simply trying to live. The country he returned to, initially the Western zones, which would become the Federal Republic of Germany, was a place of physical destruction and moral reconstruction. The physical destruction was visible on every street corner: the bombed buildings, the rubble fields, the infrastructure waiting to be rebuilt. The moral reconstruction was less visible, but in some ways more demanding. Germany was being required, by the conditions of its defeat and occupation, to reckon with what it had done and become. Every German who had lived through the Third Reich, who had served it, or supported it, or simply endured it, was part of that reckoning, whether they chose to engage with it or not. Wenck chose, characteristically, the path of work rather than the path of elaboration. He did not write his memoirs in the immediate post-war years. He did not lecture. He did not position himself within the emerging West German political landscape. He found a job in the private sector, in an industry that had nothing to do with military affairs, and he applied to it the same focused professional competence that had characterized everything he had done in uniform. The boy general was becoming, quietly and deliberately, a civilian. The discipline that had built the officer was now being redirected toward the more ordinary but no less demanding project of building a life in a country that needed, above everything, to be rebuilt. Chapter 11. After the Guns. The Quiet Life of a Soldier Who Chose People. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949 on the territory of the Western Allied occupation zones, was from its earliest days a project of deliberate reinvention. It was a state that had been required, by the circumstances of its creation, to build democratic institutions on ground that had spent 12 years producing their opposite. It needed engineers, administrators, business people, civil servants, people with organizational competence who could direct the reconstruction of a physical and institutional landscape that had been damaged in every conceivable way. Among the people available for this task was a generation of former military officers who had, whatever their moral complications, been trained to organize large-scale human activity under pressure. Their skills transferred. Walther Wenck entered the private sector in the years following his release from captivity, eventually joining the West German corporate world in a role that suited his particular combination of organizational ability and operational discipline. He worked for several years in a logistics and industrial management capacity, eventually rising to a senior position at the Hamburg-based company Diehl, a manufacturing firm whose products in the post-war period had moved emphatically into civilian applications. The transition from commanding an army to managing a corporate enterprise is less conceptually distant than it might appear. Both require the ability to assess resources against objectives, to identify the critical constraints on an operation, to communicate clearly with people at multiple levels of an organization, and to make decisions under conditions of incomplete information. Wenck did all of these things, apparently, as well in the boardroom as he had done in the field. His personal life in the post-war years was, by the accounts available, marked by the kind of ordinary human texture that rarely attaches to military legends. He had a family. He lived in the Federal Republic. He maintained relationships with former colleagues from the wartime military, the network of surviving officers who formed a community of shared experience in post-war West Germany, men who had the particular bond of people who have been through the same extreme events and emerged carrying knowledge that cannot be fully communicated to those who were not there. These relationships were, in the immediate post-war decades, complicated by the moral atmosphere of the New Germany, the denazification process, the Nuremberg trials, the ongoing historical and legal scrutiny of the Wehrmacht's role in the regime's crimes, but they were not dissolved by it. The question of the Wehrmacht's moral record, the degree to which the professional German army was complicit in the crimes of the regime it served, was one of the most contested historical and political questions in West Germany from the late 1940s through the 1990s and beyond. For decades, a widely accepted narrative, promoted partly by surviving officers and partly by West German institutions that needed a usable military tradition for the newly forming Bundeswehr, held that the Wehrmacht had been a professional fighting force that had conducted itself according to the conventions of war and had been distinct in its institutional culture from the SS and other party formations responsible for the worst atrocities. This narrative, known in German historical discussion as the saubere Wehrmacht, the clean Wehrmacht, was comprehensively dismantled by historical scholarship in the final decades of the 20th century, particularly through the work of historians who demonstrated that Wehrmacht formations had been directly involved in crimes against civilians and prisoners of war across multiple theaters. Wenck's position within this larger historical revision was always somewhat specific, because his wartime record was different in character from the formations and commanders most directly implicated. He had spent the majority of the war as a staff officer and operational commander whose primary focus was conventional military operations. The 12th Army's final operations, the redirection toward the Elbe, the refugee rescue, the corridor holding that had saved tens of thousands of lives, placed him in an unusual category. A senior German officer whose most significant command decision had been, effectively, an act of deliberate humanitarianism, conducted in defiance of his explicit orders. This was not a narrative that could be used to rehabilitate the Wehrmacht as an institution, but it was a narrative that distinguished the man from the institution he had served. In the 1950s and 60s, as West Germany debated whether and how to rebuild a military establishment, the Bundeswehr was formally established in 1955 as part of the NATO alliance. The question of what kind of military tradition it should inherit was deeply contested. Some argued for a complete break, a new military culture built on entirely different principles from the Wehrmacht. Others argued for continuity with what they characterized as the honorable professional traditions of the German officer corps, distinct from the crimes of the regime. Wenck was occasionally cited in these discussions, not as a symbol of Wehrmacht virtue, but as a specific example of an officer who, in the war's final hours, had placed civilian lives above regime commands. That specific example carried weight that more generalized arguments about professional honor could not match. He gave occasional interviews in later years, carefully, without seeking the public platform that some of his contemporaries used for various purposes. He was asked, repeatedly, about the final days, about the decision to turn toward the Elbe, about the civilians on the roads, about whether he had ever seriously believed he could reach Berlin. His answers, as preserved in the German-language historical literature from this period, were consistent and characteristically undramatic. He had known Berlin could not be saved. He had moved east, as far as was operationally viable, not far enough to break the Soviet encirclement, but far enough to keep the corridor open. He had moved west to save the people who could still be saved. He did not frame this as a heroic personal choice. He framed it, in the language of the professional soldier he had always been, as what the situation required. In the 1970s, when German and international historians were producing more systematic accounts of the war's final phase in Europe, drawing on newly available archives, survivor testimonies, and the retrospective assessments of participants on all sides, Wenck's role at the Elbe began to receive more sustained scholarly attention. The historian Cornelius Ryan, whose book on the fall of Berlin became one of the most widely read accounts of those final weeks, included material on Wenck's operations. The image that emerged from these accounts was consistent. A technically brilliant officer who had used the professional freedom available to him in the very last hours of a catastrophic war to redirect a broken army toward the only humane outcome still achievable. His final years were spent in the Federal Republic, in the quiet domesticity of a retired senior executive who had spent his working life building things rather than talking about what he had done when the world was burning. He died on the 1st of May, 1982, appropriately, given the date, in a car accident on an Austrian road. He was 81 years old, the obituaries noted. Variously, his military rank, his role in the final defense of Berlin, his successful corporate career. The most honest of them noted the Elbe, and the people who crossed it because of him, and the specific quality of moral clarity that had made that crossing possible. Chapter 12. Legacy. The man. The history books argue about. Underscore. The historiography of the Second World War's final phase in Europe is, 6 decades after the events themselves, a vast and still contested field. The scholarship moves in waves. New archives opened, new testimonies reassessed, old narratives challenged by evidence that earlier researchers did not have access to. Within this field, Walther Wenck occupies an interesting position, a figure whose factual story is reasonably well established, but whose interpretation, what it means, what it says about the war, and about the men who fought it, remains genuinely open. The most straightforward version of the Wenck story is the one most commonly found in popular histories of the Berlin campaign. The young general given an impossible order, who recognized its impossibility and used the military machinery at his disposal to accomplish something humanly valuable in its place. In this version, Wenck is essentially a hero of a specific, limited kind. Not the hero of a victorious army, but the hero of a managed retreat. A man who used the freedom of command to save lives, when saving lives was the only form of success available. This interpretation is supported by the operational record, is consistent with the accounts of those who served under him, and is morally coherent in a way that makes it appealing as a narrative. It is also, in its outlines, accurate. But the more demanding historiographical question is the one that surrounds Wenck's earlier service, the years before April 1945, when he was functioning as one of the most important staff officers in the German army, enabling the operational machinery of a state that was, simultaneously, conducting genocide. This question does not have an easy answer, and the most honest historical treatments of Wenck acknowledge it without resolving it neatly. He was not personally involved in the crimes of the regime. There is no evidence, in the available historical record, that he ordered or participated in atrocities, but he was, for 6 years, a highly effective component of the military instrument that made those crimes possible, in the practical sense that military conquest and occupation created the conditions in which they occurred. The professional soldier's claim that he was serving Germany rather than the regime is not entirely false, but it is not entirely adequate either. German historians who have studied this period in depth tend to treat Wenck's case with a nuance that popular treatments often flatten. The distinction they draw, and it is a real distinction, even if it does not fully resolve the moral question, is between officers who actively participated in criminal orders and officers who did not. Wenck falls clearly in the second category. He operated within a system he did not design and did not challenge politically. He applied his professional skills to the operations assigned to him. At the moment when a genuinely independent moral choice became available, when the gap between what he had been ordered to do and what he could actually accomplish made a personal decision inescapable, he chose the option that preserved human life rather than the option that honored the regime's command. That choice is not nothing, but it also exists within a longer career of service to a state that was committing the worst crimes in modern European history, and the relationship between those two things is the relationship that history is still working out. The Twelfth Army itself, the formation that Wenck built and led in the war's final weeks, became a symbol in West German historical memory that carried different meanings for different people. For the survivors who had crossed the Elbe, and for their descendants, it was simply the army that had saved them, the operational structure that had kept the corridor open long enough for their grandparents or great-grandparents to reach the Western Bank. For military historians, it was an interesting case study in emergency formation of combat power and the operational flexibility available to a skilled commander, even within the constraints of a collapsing command structure. For the more critical tradition of German historical scholarship, it was a complicated legacy, genuine humanitarian action conducted within the framework of a military that had served criminal ends, at a moment when serving those ends was no longer possible, rather than a moment of principled early refusal. The international dimension of Wenck's legacy is also worth considering. He was one of the relatively few German senior commanders whose operational decisions in the war's final phase received, within a reasonable period after the war, a degree of positive acknowledgement from former enemies. American officers who had been on the western bank of the Elbe in May of 1945 and had watched the crossings were, in later years, willing to describe what they had seen with something approaching approval. Not approval of the war or the state that Wenck had served, but recognition of a specific act of human decency conducted under extreme conditions. That recognition crossed national lines, and crossing national lines after a war like that was not an ordinary achievement. The contrast between Wenck's post-war reputation and that of many of his contemporaries is instructive. The German officer corps of the Second World War produced, in its post-war survivors, a wide spectrum of post-defeat conduct. Men who denied everything, men who claimed all credit and bore no responsibility, men who genuinely cooperated with historical reckoning, men who helped rebuild German military culture in ways that drew honest lessons from the catastrophe. Wenck sits, in this spectrum, at the more honest end. Not because he wrote extensively about his experience or made public claims about his own virtue, but because his silence was not the silence of concealment. It was the silence of a man who had done what the moment required and did not feel the need to elaborate on it. One of the more revealing windows into Wenck's character comes from the testimony of officers who served under him in the final weeks. The consistent theme in these accounts is not tactical brilliance or operational innovation, though those qualities appear in the record. The consistent theme is trustworthiness. His men believed, apparently without needing to be told explicitly, that Wenck would not spend their lives on objectives that served no purpose. They believed that when he ordered them to hold a position, the holding served a real function, that the people behind them were actually moving, that the corridor was actually open, that the cost was being paid for something real. That belief, the soldier's faith that his commander is telling him the truth about what the sacrifice is for, is not something that can be faked. It accumulates over years of professional conduct and is either present in the relationship between a commander and his troops, or it is not. In Wenck's case, it was present, and in the forests around Halber and on the banks of the Elbe in late April and early May of 1945. It was the difference between organized extraction and catastrophic dissolution. The question of what Wenck's story means, in the larger context of the Second World War and the civilization that produced it, is not ultimately a question with a single answer. It is a question that each generation of readers and viewers has to engage with in the terms available to their moment, with access to scholarship that earlier generations lacked, with a distance from the events that makes some things clearer and others more remote, with the particular combination of knowledge and imagination that honest historical engagement requires. What the story offers is not a straightforward moral, not a tale of the good soldier versus the bad state, because the relationship between soldier and state is never that clean, and Wenck's story is too carefully documented to sustain that simplification. What it offers instead is something more valuable, a case study in the specific, limited, costly, and genuine forms that moral agency can take within a catastrophic institutional context. Walther Wenck was not a saint. He was not a resistor. He was a professional soldier who served a criminal state with great competence for 6 years, and then, in the final weeks of the worst war in human history, used the professional freedom available to him to accomplish the last humane thing his situation allowed. He saved tens of thousands of lives by pointing an army in the right direction. He crossed a river. He told the truth about what was possible. In a war that killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, by the varying estimates of those who have tried to count, those things are not small. They are not a full account, but they are real, and they are his. And they are what the long, quiet story of Walther Wenck, from the cathedral town of Wittenberg to the muddy bank of the Elbe, finally comes to rest on. The boy general lived for 37 more years after the war ended. He built things. He maintained his silence. He crossed the river. And somewhere in that combination, the building, the silence, the crossing, is the most honest portrait available of a man who lived through the worst of human history and chose, when the choice was finally his, alone to make, to point toward the living rather than the dead. Chapter 13. The Bundeswehr Question. What should a new army remember? In the spring of 1955, a decade after the guns fell silent over a shattered Europe, the Federal Republic of Germany did something that would have seemed unimaginable to many people a few years earlier. It began building an army, not the covert rearmament of the interwar years, hidden behind euphemisms and paper organizations, but an open, formally constituted military force, established by law, equipped by allies, and embedded within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's collective defense structure. The Bundeswehr, as it was called, was the West German answer to a Cold War security dilemma. The Federal Republic sat on the front line of a potential Soviet advance into Western Europe, and the Western Allies concluded, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, that German soldiers defending German ground were a more practical proposition than an indefinitely extended occupation army. But the creation of the Bundeswehr immediately raised a question that had no clean answer. What tradition should this new institution inherit? An army does not simply materialize from organizational charts and equipment procurement. It requires a culture, a set of professional values, a relationship with its own history, a sense of what it means to be a soldier in the particular national and institutional tradition in which it is embedded. For almost every other NATO army, this question could be answered by reaching back to the recent war and its victories. The British remembered El Alamein and Normandy. The Americans remembered the beaches of the Pacific and the liberation of Western Europe. The French had the Free French Forces and the Resistance as foundational narratives. Germany had none of these available in any straightforward sense. What Germany had was the Wehrmacht, the army that had fought the war, and fought it in most operational theaters, with formidable effectiveness. The question of whether and how to draw on that institution as a source of tradition for the new Bundeswehr was one of the most contested debates in West German civil-military relations from the mid-1950s onward. The opponents of Wehrmacht tradition cited, accurately and insistently, the demonstrated involvement of Wehrmacht formations in war crimes, the murder of prisoners of war, the participation in operations against civilian populations on the Eastern Front, the logistical support provided, in some cases, to the deportation operations of the SS. These were not peripheral or aberrational incidents. They were documented, systematic, and widespread. Drawing on the Wehrmacht as a source of professional inspiration required either ignoring this record or finding some way to separate the institution's operational history from its moral one. Neither of those operations was intellectually honest. The proponents of selective Wehrmacht inheritance, and there were serious people among them, not merely unreconstructed veterans seeking rehabilitation, argued that the German officer corps had contained individuals and tendencies that were genuinely distinct from the regime's criminal projects. The resistance plotters of the 20th of July, the officers who had defied criminal orders, the commanders who had prioritized military professionalism over political compliance. They argued that a usable military tradition could be constructed from these elements without endorsing the institution as a whole. And it was in this context, the search for specific, defensible examples of German military conduct that could anchor a new professional culture, that Wenck's name appeared with some frequency. His conduct in the final weeks of the war was precisely the kind of specific example that this argument required. Here was a senior German officer who, when faced with an order that would have consumed his army in a pointless final offensive, had used his professional judgment to redirect that army toward a human purpose that saved tens of thousands of lives. He had not plotted against the regime. He had not made dramatic speeches or public gestures. He had simply used the space between the order and its execution to accomplish something decent. That was not a revolutionary act. It was a professional one. And in the Bundeswehr's foundational debates about what kind of soldier the new army wanted to produce, the concept of innere Führung, the model of the citizen soldier who exercised moral judgment within institutional constraints, Wenck's example was genuinely instructive. The concept of innere Führung, which translates roughly as inner leadership or leadership from within, was the foundational doctrinal innovation of the early Bundeswehr, developed primarily by General Wolf Graf von Baudissin and his colleagues in the early 1950s. It rejected both the blind obedience model, associated with the worst of Prussian military tradition, and the pure individualism that would make military organization impossible. Its central claim was that the soldier of a democratic state must exercise moral agency within the institutional context of military service, must be capable of identifying and refusing criminal orders while maintaining the professional discipline and commitment that effective military service requires. This was not an easy balance to theorize, and it was even harder to institutionalize. But it was a serious attempt to learn something genuine from the catastrophe, rather than simply rebrand it. Wenck never served in the Bundeswehr. He was of the generation that had been formed entirely by the old army, and he had chosen the private sector in preference to any return to military life. But the debates that produced the Bundeswehr's foundational culture were debates about what men like Wenck had done right and what others had done wrong, and in that sense, he was present in them without being physically involved. The historians and officer educators who built the Bundeswehr's professional ethic were drawing on a catalogue of specific cases, trying to extract from the wreckage of the Wehrmacht's moral record some basis for a different kind of military culture. Wenck's case was one of the cleaner examples in a very complicated data set. By the 1960s and 70s, as the Bundeswehr became an established institution and West Germany normalized within the Atlantic Alliance, the urgency of these foundational debates faded somewhat. The new army was functioning, the doctrine was in place. The pressing questions of the Cold War, deterrence, forward defense, the operational plans for a potential Soviet assault through the Fulda Gap, displaced the retrospective questions about Wehrmacht tradition. But the questions did not disappear. They moved from policy debate to historical scholarship, and in that form they became, if anything, more precise and more demanding. Historians began examining individual cases more carefully than policy debates had allowed, asking harder questions about specific decisions and specific moments. When they got to Wenck, they found a story that was more complicated than the simple heroic version, but also more interesting, because it was true. The Bundeswehr's relationship with its Wehrmacht inheritance remained contested well into the late 20th century and beyond. Each decade produced new controversies. Debates about which barracks should be named after which officers. Debates about how the Wehrmacht exhibition of the 1990s had represented the army's crimes. Debates about the proper way to honor military service within a democratic society, shaped by the memory of totalitarianism. Through all of these debates, the specific case of the Elbe crossing, of Wenck's 12th Army, and the corridor it held, functioned as a kind of reference point, an example of what German military professionalism could look like when the professional's moral judgment was engaged, rather than suspended. It was not a redemption narrative for the Wehrmacht as a whole. Nothing could serve that function. But it was, at minimum, evidence that the institution had contained people capable of choosing differently when the choice was presented clearly enough. The deeper legacy of these debates for the Bundeswehr was less about specific individuals than about the institutional culture they helped to build. The German military of the late 20th and early 21st centuries became, by the assessment of most NATO partners, one of the more professionally and morally sophisticated military institutions in the alliance, distinguished less by raw combat power than by the integration of ethical reasoning into professional military education, by the seriousness with which it engaged with its own historical record, and by the specific kind of officer it tried to produce, competent, disciplined, and capable of the moral courage that Wenck had demonstrated at the Elbe. The boy general never held a lecture or a commission in that new institution, but in a real sense, his story was part of its foundation. Chapter 14. The Survivors Speak. Voices from the Corridor. History is not made only by generals. It is made, in equal and often more intimate measure, by the ordinary people caught in the spaces between commands. The men and women whose names appear in no operational orders and no battle citations, but whose experiences constitute the actual texture of events. In the story of Walther Wenck and the 12th Army, the voice that matters most is not his. It is the voice of the people who stood on the eastern bank of the Elbe in the first days of May 1945, watching the bridge at Tungermunde and waiting for it to still be there when they reached it. Those voices, recorded in diaries, in testimony given to historians, in letters written years later by people who had spent decades processing what they had survived, are the measure against which Wenck's decisions must ultimately be assessed. The survivors of the Elbe crossing were not a homogeneous group. They included soldiers from the 9th Army, men who had been fighting since the Seelow Heights battle in mid-April, who had retreated through the Halbe forests under continuous pressure, who arrived at the crossing points exhausted beyond the ordinary meaning of that word, carrying wounds both physical and psychological that some of them would never fully recover from. They included Wehrmacht support personnel, Volkssturm members who had been conscripted in the final desperate mobilization of the regime's last months, and officer candidates who had been pulled from their training schools to fill holes in the front before they had ever completed their preparation. They included civilians, families from East Prussian towns and Brandenburg villages who had joined the westward movement weeks or months earlier and who had been moving, sometimes on foot, through one of the coldest springs in recent memory, toward whatever safety looked like. The civilian survivors in particular left accounts that carry a quality of detail that military histories rarely contain. Women who had walked for weeks with children on their backs, elderly men who had not been able to move fast enough to stay with the main groups and had somehow survived anyway, finding the edges of Wenck's corridor and following them west. Families who had been separated in the chaos of the Halbe fighting and had found each other again on the western bank of the Elbe, in the initial processing areas where American soldiers were organizing the mass of humanity arriving from the east. The specific textures of these stories, the cold, the hunger, the disorientation of people who had lost their homes and were not certain they had a future, constitute the human reality for which Wenck's operational decisions were, in the final accounting, responsible. One dimension of the survivor accounts that appears repeatedly is the role of Wenck's radio broadcasts in organizing the movement of people who had no other reliable orientation. In the forests around Halbe, and in the broader territory between Berlin and the Elbe, the normal mechanisms of civilian orientation, roads, signs, local knowledge, functional institutions, had broken down. The radio transmissions from the 12th Army, which could be received by military units with equipment and sometimes by civilians with access to receivers, functioned as a kind of navigational beacon, not precise enough to give exact routes, but consistent enough in their directional message. Move west. The corridor is open. Come toward the sound of the fighting on that side, to give people moving in fear and confusion a bearing to follow. The broadcasts were military communications. Their effect was, in part, the organization of a civilian migration. The experience of the crossing itself varied enormously, depending on when and where it happened. The people who crossed in the first days, when the bridge at Tangermunde still held its most functional configuration and the Soviet pursuit was not yet fully pressing on the eastern bank, found an experience that was frightening but manageable. The people who crossed in the last hours, when Soviet forces were actively firing on the crossing points, when the rearguard was absorbing attacks to buy minutes, when the bridge structure was deteriorating under the weight of continuous traffic, found something much closer to controlled chaos. Several accounts describe people falling into the river during crossings, being pulled out or not, the water cold enough in early May to make immersion rapidly dangerous. The margin between surviving and not surviving, for many of the people who made these crossings, was very thin. On the western bank, the Americans were present. The accounts from this transition, from the eastern chaos to the American zone, have a quality of almost dreamlike contrast that several survivors explicitly noted in their testimony. The American soldiers were organized. They had food, actual food, hot food in some cases, distributed from field kitchens that had been established at the processing points. They were not, by these accounts, hostile. They were professionally efficient in the way that a well-supplied army in control of its situation is efficient, calm, procedural, focused on processing rather than punishing. For people who had been moving for weeks through conditions of disintegration and violence and hunger, the encounter with this particular kind of order was, by several accounts, almost incomprehensible. The war they had been living inside had convinced them, at some level, that organized decency was a thing of the past. The Americans on the western bank of the Elbe were evidence that it was not. The longer-term trajectories of the survivors varied as widely as their origins. Some were from the western zones of Germany and were eventually able to return to communities, to family networks, to something approximating the lives they had left. Others were from the eastern territories, East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, that were, under the territorial settlements of the post-war period, being permanently transferred to Polish administration, their German populations expelled in what became one of the largest forced population movements in European history. For these survivors, the Elbe crossing had saved their lives, but had not saved their homes, which no longer existed in any form they could return to. The aftermath of their survival was displacement, the construction of new lives in an unfamiliar West Germany, the particular grief of people who had lost not just possessions, but the specific places that had formed them. Wenck's name appears in survivor accounts with varying degrees of prominence. Some survivors knew exactly who had commanded the army whose corridor they had used, and explicitly credited him in their later recollections. Others knew only that there had been a general, that the army had been moving west rather than east, that the bridge had been held open for them. The difference did not matter to the people involved. What mattered was the crossing, not the biography of the man who had enabled it. But for historical purposes, the survivor accounts collectively provide something that operational records cannot: the experiential confirmation that the decisions made at the command level translated into actual human outcomes at the individual level. People lived because of those decisions. That is not an abstraction. It is the most concrete form of historical fact available. Decades after the crossing, some survivors participated in memorial events, reunions, and historical projects that attempted to document what had happened in those final weeks. By this point, they were elderly, and their accounts carried the particular mixture of precision and gap that characterizes memory, shaped by extreme experience and long time. Some details were vivid with the clarity of survival: the temperature of the water, the sound of artillery, the face of an American soldier offering food. Others had merged into a general impression of movement and fear and eventual safety that resisted specific reconstruction. What survived most completely, in almost every account, was the emotional truth of the experience: the fear, the exhaustion, the moment of crossing, and the particular quality of the relief on the western bank. Not triumph, not joy in any ordinary sense, but the specific, almost disbelieving relief of a person who has moved through something terrible and come out the other side breathing. Those emotional truths are the final measure of what Walther Wenck accomplished at the Elbe. His operational decisions were the mechanism. The survivors' experiences were the result. Between the mechanism and the result was a space filled with individual acts of courage and endurance by thousands of people, soldiers and civilians alike, whose names are not in this documentary and whose full stories will never be reconstructed. They deserve acknowledgement precisely because they cannot be fully named. The corridor Wenck held open was a structure made of military formations and logistical systems and radio transmissions, but it was walked through by individual people, one at a time, each carrying everything they had left, and each arriving on the western bank as a specific, irreplaceable human being. The scale of that arrival is the scale of what was saved. Under Chapter 15, The Historian's Battle. Rewriting Wenck in the Age of Critical Scholarship. Underscore. Every significant figure in the history of the Second World War has been rewritten at least once by subsequent scholarship, and usually more than once. The first wave of post-war historiography was shaped, inevitably, by the perspectives and agendas of its moment. The need to assign clear moral categories to participants in an event of almost incomprehensible moral complexity the limitations of available sources, and the proximity of researchers to events they were still, in various ways, living through. The second wave, arriving from the 1960s onward, had access to newly opened archives, the accumulated scholarship of the first wave to critique, and a sufficient distance from the events to ask questions that earlier researchers had been unable or unwilling to formulate. The third wave, from the 1980s, and particularly the 90s, brought the methods and imperatives of social history, memory studies, and moral philosophy to a field that had previously been dominated by military and political historians. Each wave found something different when it looked at Walther Wenck. The first generation of accounts, written primarily in the 1950s and early 1960s, drawing heavily on the memoirs and testimonies of surviving German officers, tended to present Wenck in broadly positive terms as part of a larger narrative about the final collapse of the Eastern Front. These accounts were shaped by the context in which they were produced. West Germany was building a new military identity. The Wehrmacht veterans community was active and well organized, and there was a strong institutional incentive to preserve narratives that distinguished honorable professional military service from the crimes of the regime. In this context, Wenck was a natural figure to highlight, a general whose most visible decision had been to save civilian lives rather than execute a futile offensive. The first-generation accounts did not fabricate this fact, but they did sometimes present it in a framework that implied a cleaner distinction between the German military and the Nazi state than the evidence supported. The American accounts from the same period, produced by historians and journalists who had direct access to American participants in the Elbe events and who were working from an Allied perspective, were generally more measured. They tended to present Wenck's decisions in the context of a military collapse, recognizing the humanitarian dimension of the Elbe crossing without using it to rehabilitate the broader institution Wenck had served. Cornelius Ryan's research, which produced one of the most influential popular accounts of the Berlin campaign, drew extensively on survivor testimony and provided a richer human texture to the events than the first German-language accounts had managed. Ryan was interested in the individuals, the specific people who had been on both sides of the Elbe, the Americans watching from the western bank, the Germans and civilians crossing from the east, and his treatment of Wenck's role was correspondingly specific and grounded. The critical turn in German historiography from the 1970s onward brought with it a more systematic interrogation of the clean Wehrmacht narrative that had served West German civil-military culture through the early decades of the Federal Republic. Historians began examining Wehrmacht operational records with a granularity that earlier scholarship had not achieved, and what they found in those records was systematically incompatible with the narrative of professional military honor that the veterans community had promoted. The participation of regular Wehrmacht formations in the murder of Jewish populations in the occupied East, the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, the anti-partisan operations that targeted civilian populations. These were not the actions of a handful of criminal individuals or ideologically corrupted special formations. They were documented in ordinary military records as standard operational practice in specific theaters and periods. The Wehrmacht exhibition that opened in Hamburg in 1995 and traveled to multiple German cities over the following years brought this scholarship to a broader public in a form that was deliberately confrontational, provoking exactly the controversy its organizers had anticipated. In this revised historiographical context, Wenck's reputation underwent its own reassessment, not a demolition, but a complication. Historians who engaged seriously with the critical scholarship could not present him simply as the good general who saved the civilians without also acknowledging that he had spent most of the war enabling the operational machinery of a state engaged in systematic murder. His career from 1939 through 1944, the brilliant staff work, the operational successes, the personal loyalty of Guderian, and the professional confidence of Hitler had been conducted in service of a war of aggression and conquest. The humanitarian act at the Elbe did not retroactively cleanse the preceding 6 years. The question of moral assessment required holding both things simultaneously, the years of service and the moment of redirection, without allowing either to cancel the other. The most intellectually serious historical treatments of Wenck from the 1990s and 2000s tended to arrive at a position that was uncomfortable in its honesty. He was neither hero nor perpetrator in any simple sense, but a professional who had been formed by and had faithfully served an institution that was complicit in catastrophic crimes, and who had, in the final weeks of that institution's existence, used the professional freedom available to him to accomplish something genuinely decent. This is not a satisfying conclusion in the way that clear moral categories are satisfying. It does not provide a usable symbol for either the rehabilitation of the Wehrmacht or its comprehensive condemnation. It provides, instead, an accurate description of a specific person in a specific situation, which is less emotionally convenient, but more historically honest than either alternative. The comparative dimension of Wenck's historical assessment, his conduct measured against other German senior commanders in the war's final phase, is also instructive. The spectrum of choices made by German generals in the spring of 1945 ranged very widely. Some commanders continued to execute obviously futile and costly defensive operations long after any rational military purpose had been served, consuming the lives of their men in compliance with orders that bore no relationship to achievable outcomes. Some participated in the summary execution of soldiers accused of desertion or defeatism in the war's final weeks, an acceleration of the regime's internal terror that cost thousands of lives. Some simply disintegrated under the pressure, issuing orders that were never executed, withdrawing to personal safety while leaving their formations without leadership. In this spectrum, Wenck's conduct, the honest assessment of the impossible, the redirection toward the humane, the personal presence at the crossing, the refusal to spend lives on objectives that no longer existed, stands at the more admirable end. That comparative assessment does not constitute a moral absolution, but it is the relevant historical comparison, and it matters. One of the more interesting dimensions of the historiographical debate around Wenck is the question of intentionality, specifically, at what point and with what degree of conscious deliberation he decided to redirect the Twelfth Army from the futile relief of Berlin toward the Elbe corridor. This question matters because the answer determines whether his conduct was the product of moral courage or simply of professional realism, whether he was making an ethical choice or an operational calculation that happened to have humanitarian consequences. The honest answer, based on the available evidence, is probably that the distinction between those two things was less clear in his mind than the question implies. He was a professional soldier in an extreme situation. His professional judgment told him that Berlin could not be saved. His professional values, the ones that had led him to feed refugees when no order required it, told him that people could be moved to safety if the army moved in the right direction. The moral and the operational were, in his case, pointing the same way. Whether that alignment was the product of prior ethical formation or pragmatic calculation was probably not a question he paused to examine while his rearguard was absorbing Soviet attacks. The most recent scholarship on the Berlin campaign and the war's final phase has benefited from the opening of Soviet and Russian archives in the post-Cold War period, which has allowed historians to assess events with access to both sides' operational records simultaneously. From the Soviet perspective, Wenck's army was a relatively minor element in the larger Berlin operation, a formation that had managed to maintain a temporary corridor before being pushed definitively to the Elbe. The scale of the Soviet investment in closing the Halbe pocket and pursuing the Ninth Army westward confirms that the Soviets took the breakout threat seriously and committed substantial forces to containing it, which in turn confirms that Wenck's ability to hold the corridor at all was a genuine military achievement rather than an unopposed movement through a vacuum. The cost to his rearguard formations was real, and the Soviet records make clear that the forces opposing those rearguards were substantial. The historiographical battle over Wenck's legacy is, ultimately, a battle about a larger question that German historical scholarship has been fighting for decades: how to think about ordinary men, not monsters, not saints, but professionally competent individuals shaped by the institutions of their time, who served a criminal state without themselves committing the crimes that defined that state's criminality. This is not a question that has a single answer, because the individuals involved were genuinely varied in their degrees of knowledge, complicity, and moral courage. Wenck represents one point on a complex human spectrum, a point that happens to be more interesting than most, because the moment of his clearest moral choice is so precisely documented and its consequences are so measurable. He remains, in the ongoing historical argument about what the Wehrmacht was and what it produced, an uncomfortable figure for all positions, too decent for the prosecution, too complicit for the defense, and too specific and human for either side's preferred generalization. Under 4. Chapter 16, Berlin 1945. In global memory, the story the world kept telling. Underscore. The fall of Berlin in the spring of 1945 has been reconstructed more often than almost any other event of the 20th century. It has been the subject of military histories, political biographies, oral history projects, journalistic accounts, academic monographs, and, perhaps most influentially, films and television productions that have carried its images and stories to audiences who would never read a monograph. Each reconstruction is shaped by its moment, the political climate of the year in which it was produced, the sources available to the researchers who made it, the cultural assumptions about what the story means and who needs to hear it. The cumulative effect of these reconstructions is a kind of layered cultural memory, a body of shared images and narratives about Berlin 1945 that exists in the collective consciousness of much of the world, independently of any specific scholarly work. The earliest cinematic and literary engagements with the Berlin campaign in the immediate post-war years tended to be shaped by the political requirements of the Cold War. For the Western powers, the Soviet capture of Berlin carried ambiguous emotional weight. It was the defeat of a shared enemy, but it was also the installation of Soviet power in the center of Europe, and the tone of Western accounts shifted depending on which of those two facts the specific moment of production required to be foregrounded. Early American accounts tended to present the final campaign as a confirmation of Allied victory, without engaging in depth with the human tragedy of the German civilian population trapped in the fighting, a reticence that reflected the political pressures of the immediate post-war period, when the defeated German civilian population was not yet a figure commanding Western sympathy. Soviet accounts, produced within the constraints of a state propaganda apparatus that required the Berlin campaign to appear as an unambiguous triumph of socialist heroism, presented a version of events that was accurate in its broad military outlines and systematically distorted in its human details. The experiences of German civilians, the conduct of Soviet forces in the occupied territories, the realities of the Elbe crossings, and what they represented. For decades, the Soviet and Russian public had access primarily to this version of events, which meant that the human dimensions of the Berlin campaign The refugees, the crossings, the complicated final decisions of German commanders like Wenck were essentially absent from the Russian cultural memory of the event. The German engagement with the memory of Berlin, 1945, was inevitably the most complex of all. For the first generation of post-war Germans, the fall of Berlin was simultaneously a liberation from the Nazi regime, a catastrophic military defeat, and the beginning of a Soviet occupation that would last, in varying forms, for 4 decades. The emotional arithmetic of this combination was difficult to navigate in public discourse, expressing grief for the German losses, the civilian casualties, the soldiers who died in the final fighting, the displaced populations of the Eastern territories, risked appearing to equate German suffering with the suffering caused by German aggression. The political and moral climate of the early Federal Republic, shaped by the imperatives of denazification and international rehabilitation, made public mourning for the German dead of Berlin, 1945, a complicated and contested act. This complexity produced, in West German cultural memory, a particular kind of repression, not of the facts themselves, which were widely known in private, but of the public emotional processing that normally accompanies national catastrophe. The stories of the refugees, the Elbe crossings, the final days in the bunker, circulated in family memory and in the veterans' community, without finding a fully comfortable place in the public national narrative. They existed in a kind of cultural semi-darkness, acknowledged but not integrated, present but not processed. It was only with the passage of time, and particularly with the generational shift of the 1980s and 90s, that these stories began to find more full-throated public expression in historical documentaries, in literary works that engaged directly with the wartime German civilian experience, in memorial initiatives that addressed the complexity of German victimhood within the larger context of German culpability. The international dimensions of Berlin 1945's cultural memory have also evolved significantly over the decades. The opening of the Cold War's political constraints in the 1990s, the reunification of Germany, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the opening of archives on multiple sides, created conditions for a more genuinely comparative and multi-perspectival historical engagement than had previously been possible. Historians could now access German, Soviet, American, and British records simultaneously, and produce accounts that held the different national experiences in the same frame. This produced a generation of scholarship and documentary work that was, on the whole, richer in human complexity and more honest in its moral accounting than anything that had come before. The figure of Walther Wenck recurred in this revised cultural memory, with particular frequency in documentary films and long-form television productions from the 1990s and 2000s. The story had the qualities that documentary production values: a central protagonist with a clear biographical arc, a decisive moment of choice, a measurable human outcome, and the haunting visual potential of the Elbe crossing itself. Productions from German, British, and American television all engaged with the Wenck story in this period, generally presenting it with a nuance that earlier popular treatments had lacked, acknowledging both the humanitarian dimension of the Elbe operation and the complex context of Wenck's overall wartime service. These productions reached audiences of millions, and their cumulative effect on the popular understanding of the Berlin campaign's final phase was substantial. The particular emotional register in which the Wenck story operates in cultural memory is different from the register of most Second World War narratives. The conventional war story moves toward triumph or toward sacrifice, toward victory earned or toward loss endured with dignity. The Wenck story moves toward neither of these poles. It moves toward a quieter kind of resolution, the recognition that in the absolute worst conditions, within a system that had produced the worst outcomes in modern history, A specific human being had made a specific choice that kept specific other human beings alive. This is not the grammar of heroic narrative. It is the grammar of something more modest and more real, the grammar of what is sometimes called, in moral philosophy, the good available. The global memory of Berlin 1945 has continued to evolve into the early decades of the 21st century, shaped by new media forms that have democratized the production and circulation of historical narrative in ways that professional historians are still assessing. YouTube, streaming platforms, podcasts, and online archive access have created a landscape in which the story of Wenck and the Twelfth Army is now accessible to audiences who would never have encountered it in the earlier media environment. Long-form documentary content of the kind that this video represents, detailed, carefully sourced, produced for audiences who want depth rather than brevity, has found substantial audiences on digital platforms, suggesting that the appetite for serious historical engagement is far broader than conventional media assumptions had assumed. The story has found new tellers and new listeners, and in finding them, it continues to do what the best historical narratives do. It asks the people who encounter it to think carefully about what the past demands of the present. Chapter 17. Comparative Command. What Wenck teaches about leadership under moral collapse. The study of military leadership under conditions of institutional moral collapse is one of the more important and underexplored fields in the history of the Second World War. Most military history is organized around the study of success and failure in conventional operational terms: who won, who lost, why, and what could have been done differently. These are important questions, but they leave out a category of problem that the Second World War generated in unusual abundance. What does a professional soldier do when the institution he serves has crossed so far into criminal territory that the conventional categories of military duty no longer provide adequate guidance? This is not a theoretical question. It was the lived situation of hundreds of thousands of officers across multiple armies in the war of 1939 to 1945. The answers they gave are a record that deserves serious study. Wenck's answer was not the only answer available. The range of responses among German senior officers to the moral situation of the Third Reich spans a spectrum that is instructive in its breadth. At one extreme were those who identified completely with the regime's goals and pursued them without reservation, translating political ideology into operational orders with no apparent internal conflict. At the other extreme were the conspirators, the officers who moved from internal dissent to active resistance and organized the assassination attempt of the 20th of July, 1944. These men paid for their choice with their lives, in many cases, and their moral courage is not in question. But they represented a very small fraction of the officer corps, and the failure of their attempt left the institutional situation unchanged. Between these two extremes was the vast middle ground where most German officers lived. Men who served, who followed orders, who maintained professional performance within a system they may have had private reservations about, and who occasionally found specific moments where a specific decision was in their hands. Wenck occupied this middle ground for most of the war and came to his defining moment not through dramatic political conversion, but through the grinding professional logic of a situation that simply ran out of other options. By late April of 1945, the choice between serving the regime and serving human life had become, for him, perfectly clear and unavoidable. Not because his values had suddenly changed, but because the circumstances had simplified to the point where the two options were in direct opposition and there was nothing left to mediate between them. The regime demanded that he spend his army on a futile offensive. Professional judgment told him the offensive was impossible, and in the gap between those two facts, he found the space to do something different. This is an important lesson about how moral agency actually operates in institutional contexts. It often does not announce itself with dramatic clarity in advance. It arrives as the accumulated weight of decisions made over years, and it becomes actionable when circumstances force a clarity that normal institutional life obscures. The comparison with other commanders in the war's final phase is revealing. General Karl Hilpert, who commanded Army Group Courland in the final weeks, chose to maintain his positions in Latvia in compliance with Hitler's explicit orders long after any military logic supported remaining there, resulting in the surrender of more than 200,000 German soldiers to Soviet captivity. Soldiers who had no strategic function in those final weeks, and whose captivity, in many cases, lasted for years, under conditions that killed a significant proportion of them. Hilpert's compliance with the order to hold Courland was professional in the narrow sense. He followed his instructions, but it was, by any broader measure of what military leadership requires, a catastrophic failure of judgment. The comparison with Wenck, who chose to ignore the impossible instruction and use his forces for the only achievable purpose, is direct and unflattering to the conventional model of obedience. The contrast with General Friedrich Paulus at Stalingrad is equally instructive, though more complex. Paulus, who commanded the Sixth Army in its encirclement, refused to break out against Hitler's explicit orders in November and December of 1942, when a breakout might still have been possible. He stayed, he waited, he hoped for relief that did not come, and in the end, he surrendered more than 90,000 surviving men to Soviet captivity in February of 1943. Men whose subsequent fate in Soviet prison camps was, for the majority of them, Paulus's compliance with the order to hold was defended by him and by others on grounds of military duty and the chain of command. But the result was the preventable death of the majority of the soldiers under his command. Wenck, in a structurally similar situation, a commander given an impossible order by a superior who was no longer engaging with operational reality, made a different choice. The comparison between the two outcomes speaks for itself. The broader literature on organizational behavior under conditions of moral stress, a field developed primarily in the context of business ethics, medical ethics, and the study of organizational failures in industries from aviation to nuclear power, has produced insights that are directly applicable to military command under the conditions of the Third Reich. The key finding across multiple disciplinary domains is that the most important factor in determining whether individuals resist unethical institutional pressures is not primarily individual moral character in the abstract, but rather the specific structure of the decision environment they face. People are much more likely to resist unethical orders when the harmful outcome is concrete and proximate, rather than abstract and remote, when they have a specific alternative action available that produces a clearly better outcome, and when they have the professional authority and standing to act on that alternative without facing immediately catastrophic personal consequences. Wenck's situation in late April of 1945 met all three of these conditions. The harm was concrete and immediate. The alternative was clearly defined, and his professional standing gave him the authority to act on it. This does not diminish the moral quality of his choice, but it helps explain why the choice was made when it was, rather than years earlier when the conditions were different. The leadership lessons that emerge from Wenck's case are not primarily about tactical or operational brilliance, though those qualities were present. They are about the relationship between professional competence and moral agency, about the ways in which genuine technical mastery of one's field can create the credibility, the authority, and the operational space that moral action sometimes requires. Wenck was listened to, and his decisions were executed because his soldiers trusted his professional judgment absolutely. That trust, built over years of combat service and accumulated through dozens of decisions made under pressure, was the instrument through which his final moral choice was translated into operational reality. Without the trust, the decision to move west rather than east would have been an order, and orders in a collapsing army are not automatically executed. With the trust, it was a direction, and the men who received it moved in that direction, because they had learned that Wenck's directions took them where they needed to go. The application of these lessons to contemporary military ethics and leadership development has been a recurrent theme in military education literature of the past several decades. The Bundeswehr's Innere Führung tradition explicitly draws on cases of this kind to argue that the cultivation of moral judgment is not antithetical to military discipline, but is, in fact, the condition for the exercise of genuine military professionalism. An officer who can only follow orders is a mechanical component in a system whose moral quality is determined entirely by those at its apex, a model that the Wehrmacht's record demonstrated with terrible clarity to be catastrophically inadequate. An officer who has developed both technical competence and moral judgment is capable of the kind of decision Wenck made, the decision that serves the actual purpose of military institutions, the protection of human beings, when the formal chain of command has lost sight of that purpose entirely. The limitations of Wenck as a model for contemporary leadership ethics must also be acknowledged honestly. His moral agency was exercised late, at the very end of a long career of service to a state whose criminality was well established by the time the most visible expression of that agency occurred. The lesson that he provides is not a lesson about early resistance or prophylactic moral courage. It is a lesson about what remains possible even very late, even inside deeply compromised institutional structures, even when the options have narrowed to a single corridor pointing west. That is a valuable lesson, but it is not a comfortable one. It says that moral agency is never entirely extinguished by institutional complicity, that the space for a decent decision can persist even in the most degraded circumstances. But it also says that waiting for that space to present itself clearly, rather than acting on imperfect moral knowledge in more ambiguous earlier circumstances, has costs. Costs that were, in Wenck's case, measured in the years of service that preceded the Elbe, and in the people who did not survive long enough to benefit from his final choice. Chapter 18. The Final Reckoning. What Walther Wenck means now. There is a particular kind of historical figure who resists easy categorization and therefore requires more from the people who study them than the figures who fit cleanly into existing moral frameworks. Walther Wenck is one of these figures. He does not fit the category of the hero, because heroes are people who choose correctly and consistently, and his record is too long and too embedded in institutional service to a criminal state to sustain that description. He does not fit the category of the perpetrator, because his personal record contains no documented commission of the crimes that defined the state he served. He does not fit the category of the resistor, because resistance implies an earlier, more costly confrontation with power that he never sought. He fits, instead, into a category that is less rhetorically satisfying, but more historically accurate. The professional, the institutional man, who spent most of his career doing what his institution asked of him, and found, in its final hours, the specific space in which what his institution asked and what human decency required diverged far enough that he chose decency. The story of the 12th Army and the Elbe crossing has continued to resonate across the decades, since it occurred not because it is a story of triumph or of unambiguous virtue, but because it is a story about what remains possible. In the most extreme circumstances imaginable, a total war in its final catastrophic phase, a command structure in complete psychological disintegration, an army assembled from fragments and positioned for an impossible mission. A man used what authority he had to point people towards safety rather than toward destruction. The scale was limited. The context was appalling. The choices available to him were constrained by years of prior decisions that he cannot be entirely separated from. And yet the outcome was real. Tens of thousands of people crossed a river and lived. That outcome is the measure of what remained possible, and the measure of what one man did with it. The question that this story poses to those who encounter it is one that has no comfortable answer. What would you have done? Not in the final weeks, when the choice had simplified to the point of clarity, but in the years before, in the 1930s, when the state was consolidating power through methods that were visible to anyone paying attention. In the early 1940s, when the consequences of that state's choices were becoming clear to officers, with access to operational information. In the middle years of the war, when the evidence of systematic murder was available, in fragments and rumors, and the observations of men returning from the East, to anyone who wanted to find it. The honest answer, for most people in most circumstances, is probably not a heroic one. Most people, in most circumstances, work within the systems that form them, follow the incentive structures that surround them, and find reasons to defer the moral confrontation that their situation might, in a more demanding accounting, require. This is not cynicism. It is a realistic description of how institutional life operates, confirmed by decades of social psychology research, as well as by historical record. What Wenck's story offers, against this background, is not a model to emulate in its entirety, but a specific, documented example of the moment when the gap between institutional obligation and moral clarity became so wide that a professional could not bridge it with the usual instruments of rationalization and deferral. It offers, in other words, evidence that the moment of genuine choice does arrive, that the accumulated weight of institutional life does not permanently foreclose the possibility of acting differently. This is a more modest offering than a heroic narrative, but it is more honest, and in its honesty, it is more useful. The person who understands that moral agency is limited, costly, and late in the historical record is better prepared for the actual experience of institutional life than the person who imagines it as early, clear, and costless. The physical places associated with Wenck's story have been absorbed by the passage of time in the way that all historical sites eventually are, either marked and commemorated or returned to the ordinary business of being geography. The Elbe still flows through the German landscape, past towns and cities whose relationship to the events of May 1945 is now largely mediated by historical markers and anniversary observations. The forests around Halbe contain a cemetery, one of the largest in Germany, that holds the remains of those who died in the fighting and the breakout attempts of that final week. The site is tended, visited, and maintained as a place of memory. The bridge at Tangermünde has been rebuilt. The river continues. Wittenberg, the town where Wenck was born on the 18th of September 1900, is today a city of moderate size in the state of Saxony-Anhalt in reunified Germany. It is famous primarily for its connection to Martin Luther, whose 500th anniversary has been extensively commemorated in recent decades. Its connection to Walther Wenck is noted in local historical literature, but does not dominate the town's public identity, which is, in its own way, appropriate. A man born in a town of deep historical resonance, who lived through one of history's most extreme episodes, who chose at the last possible moment to use his professional authority for a human purpose. Such a man does not require a monument. The crossing he enabled is monument enough, in the sense that monuments matter. It is a thing that actually happened, documented in the records of the armies involved, in the testimony of those who survived it, and in the long subsequent lives of the people whose existence depended on the corridor he held open. Wenck died on the 1st of May 1982. The date carries its own resonance. It was the 37th anniversary of the day that the announcement of Hitler's death was broadcast from the Hamburg radio station. The day that the last pieces of the regime were beginning to acknowledge, in public, what had been obvious for days in private. He died in a car accident, as he had nearly died in another car accident in February of 1945, the crash that had sidelined him for 6 weeks and left him still recovering when the order to command the 12th Army arrived. There is something in the repetition of this circumstance that invites reflection. Though history is not in the business of providing neat symbolic structures on demand. He lived 81 years. He crossed many rivers. The most important crossing was the one he enabled for others, not the one he made himself. The world that Walther Wenck was born into, the Wilhelmina German Empire of 1900, confident in its military power, expanding its industrial base, preparing unknowingly for a catastrophe that would unmake it, is as remote from the present as the Bronze Age is from most of the students who study it. The specific military and political structures that formed him, the doctrines he was trained in, the crises he navigated, these are part of a historical world so thoroughly destroyed by the war itself that they require active imaginative reconstruction to access. What is not remote, and what does not require historical translation, is the fundamental situation his story describes. A person, inside an institution, with a set of professional skills and a limited amount of authority, facing a moment when what the institution demands and what human decency requires are in direct opposition. That situation is not historical. It recurs. It recurs in militaries and corporations and governments and hospitals and schools, in every complex institution that human beings build. And the question it poses, what do you do with the authority you have, in the moment when the institution has lost its way, is one that each generation has to answer for itself, in the specific circumstances it inherits, with whatever courage and clarity it can bring to bear. The boy general from Wittenberg answered it once. At a river, in the ruins of a civilization he had spent his career serving. The answer was imperfect, late, costly, and limited. It was also real, and in the long, quiet record of human beings making do with the options available to them, the real and limited and late and costly acts of decency are, often, the ones that matter most. The river held, the corridor held, the people crossed. That is enough. That is the whole story.